I drained my life savings to build our dream and gave my wife everything she asked for. 10 years of marriage, 10 years of sacrifices. But on our anniversary dinner, she slid a manila envelope across the table and chose my own brother. A week later, she called me sobbing and begging for my help because he found the papers. I nearly hung up until she revealed what they had stolen from me. My name is Harrison Caldwell, and this is how the worst night of my life became the ultimate trap for the people who betrayed me. I am 39 years old, and for the past 15 years I played by the rules. I worked as a senior underwriter for one of the largest commercial insurance firms in the country. My entire job was to assess risk. I evaluated disasters for a living. I looked at spreadsheets and calculated the exact moment a company might collapse under the weight of its own liabilities. I spent my days predicting the unpredictable for massive corporations. I knew how to spot a bad investment from a mile away, but I never saw the collapse of my own family coming. I thought I had the perfect American life. My wife, Victoria, ran a luxury interior design business, catering to the wealthiest clients in our city. When we first met, she had big dreams and zero capital. I loved her ambition. I wanted to see her succeed more than anything in the world. So, when her business hit a massive financial wall 3 years ago, I did what I thought a good husband was supposed to do. I quietly emptied my entire retirement fund to keep her company afloat. I drained my 401k. I took on extra shifts reviewing complex commercial claim files late into the night. I sacrificed my own comfort and my own financial security so she could keep her high-end showroom open and maintain her pristine public image. I also invested everything I had left into our 2 children. I paid for them to attend an elite language immersion program. They were learning German and Italian. I wanted them to have the global future I never had. I wanted to give them every advantage in the world so they would never have to struggle the way I did when I was starting out. I believed that providing for my family was my ultimate purpose. I was the responsible one, the one who made sure the bills were paid on time and the safety nets were firmly in place. My brother Julian lived a completely different life. Julian was a flashy real estate developer who drove a brand new Porsche and lived in a $3 million estate on the edge of town. He was the golden child of our family. He always took the shortcuts. He schmoozed investors and flipped commercial properties using aggressive high-interest loans. He lived for the applause and the spotlight. He wore custom Italian suits and threw lavish parties that ended up in the local society pages. I lived for the quiet moments reading with my kids on the living room rug. I was the reliable older brother while Julian was the star. Tonight was our 10th wedding anniversary. I booked a table at the Oakwood Country Club. It was the most exclusive and expensive restaurant in our city. The kind of place with dark mahogany walls, crystal chandeliers, and waiters wearing white gloves. I had spent weeks planning this evening. Victoria had been incredibly distant lately. She was always on her phone, hiding her screen when I walked into the room. She was always taking sudden weekend business trips to view properties for her clients. I told myself it was just the stress of running her design firm. I thought tonight would be the night we finally reconnected. I wore my best tailored suit. I arrived early and ordered her favorite vintage wine. I wanted to remind her of the love we shared before the stress of money and careers took over our lives. She arrived 20 minutes late. She did not apologize. She walked through the dining room, drawing the eyes of everyone in the restaurant. She wore a stunning black designer dress, but her eyes were cold and vacant. She sat down across from me and barely looked at my face. Her posture was rigid. I tried to reach across the table to take her hand. I wanted to tell her how beautiful she looked. But before my fingers could even brush hers, she pulled her hand away and crossed her arms over her chest. Before the waiter could even pour the wine, Victoria reached into her designer bag. She did not pull out an anniversary gift. She did not pull out a card. She pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope and slid it across the white linen tablecloth. It stopped right next to my water glass. The sound of the rough paper scraping against the fine fabric felt unusually loud. I looked at the envelope and then at her. I asked her what this was. I forced a smile, thinking perhaps it was travel documents for a surprise vacation or a brochure for a new house. She stared right through me with an expression of absolute indifference and told me to open it. My hands were steady as I undid the metal clasp. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. The bold black letters at the top of the first page hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Divorce papers. I sat there frozen in the middle of the crowded dining room. The clinking of crystal glasses and the soft piano music faded into a dull roar in my ears. The air left my lungs. I looked at the woman I had loved for a decade. I asked her why. I asked her what happened to us. I reminded her about our children. I reminded her about the life we built together from scratch. I reminded her of the sacrifices I made to keep her dreams alive when everyone else told her to quit. She did not shed a single tear. She did not look away. She looked at me with absolute contempt. She said I was suffocating her. She said I was a boring underwriter who only cared about spreadsheets and safety. She said she needed passion and ambition and a man who actually knew how to conquer the world. She told me I was a failure because I gave up my own dreams to fund hers. She weaponized my own sacrifice against me. She said she was tired of pretending to respect a man who lacked the killer instinct to take what he wanted. I was struggling to find my voice when a shadow fell over our table. I looked up and saw my brother Julian. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that cost more than my first car. His hair was perfectly styled, and his expensive watch caught the light of the chandelier. He did not look surprised to see the divorce papers resting on the table. He pulled up a chair uninvited and sat down right next to my wife. He placed his hand confidently over hers. Victoria did not pull away in shock. Instead, she intertwined her fingers with his and leaned her shoulder against his arm. Julian looked at me with a smug, arrogant smirk that I had hated since we were children. He leaned forward and told me they did not want to hide it in the shadows anymore. I felt the blood drain completely from my face. My stomach twisted into a violent knot. I asked him what he was talking about. I demanded to know what was going on. Victoria spoke up. Her voice was steady and completely devoid of guilt or shame. She told me she and Julian had been seeing each other for the past year. My own brother, the man I grew up with, the man who sat at my dining room table for Thanksgiving dinner and played games with my children. He had been sleeping with my wife for 12 months. I thought about all those weekend business trips Victoria took. I thought about the times Julian claimed he was out of town viewing real estate properties in other states. They had been together, laughing at me, sleeping together in luxury hotels while I stayed home reading bedtime stories to our kids, spending the money I was desperately working to provide for our family. I looked at Julian and asked him how he could do this to his own blood. I asked him how he could look me in the eye after destroying my family. Julian laughed. It was a short and cruel sound that cut through the polite murmurs of the restaurant. He said it was just business. He said Victoria realized she backed the wrong horse a long time ago. He told me I was always meant to be the worker bee while he was meant to be the king. He said Victoria deserved a life of absolute luxury and excitement that a simple insurance underwriter could never provide. He bragged that he had already introduced her to his high-rolling investors and that they were a power couple now. My mind raced to the devastating financial reality of my situation. I had emptied my accounts to save her business. I had nothing left to my name because I gave every single dollar to her. And she had used my money to finance a secret life with my brother. She had used my stability as a launching pad to jump into his bed. I slammed my fist on the table, causing the expensive silverware to rattle. I told her she would not get away with this. I told her I would fight for full custody of our children, and I would expose both of them in court. I swore I would strip her business bare and let everyone know exactly what kind of people they truly were. Victoria smiled. It was the same cold, calculated smile a predator gives a trapped animal right before the kill. She reached into her bag one more time and pulled out a second legal document. She told me I would not be fighting for anything. She slid the paper over the divorce petition. It was a temporary restraining order signed by a family court judge just 4 hours ago. I read the claims printed on the official court stationery. They were complete and utter fabrications. She had sworn under oath that I was emotionally volatile. She claimed I had a history of aggressive outbursts and severe financial abuse. She stated she feared for her safety and the safety of our 2 children. Because of her vicious lies, the judge had granted an immediate order of protection. Victoria looked me dead in the eye and told me the locks on our house had already been changed. She told me my access to our joint checking and savings accounts had been frozen by her legal team that afternoon. She had timed it perfectly with the precision of an assassin. She waited until the banks closed and the courts shut down for the weekend to drop the hammer. I had no home to go back to tonight. I had no money to pay for a hotel. I could not even call my children without violating a court order and risking immediate arrest. I was stripped of every single thing I had worked for over the past 15 years in a matter of 5 brutal minutes. My wife and my brother had conspired to erase my existence. Julian stood up and adjusted his expensive silk tie. He looked down at me like I was garbage left on the sidewalk. He reached into his tailored pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He tossed it onto the table with a flick of his wrist. It landed right on top of the restraining order. He told me to take the money and call a cab to a cheap motel. He said it was the last handout I would ever get from the family. He told me to stay away from his new life and his new family. Then he offered his arm to my wife. Victoria stood up, smoothed out her elegant black dress, picked up her designer bag, and took his arm. They turned their backs on me and walked out of the country club together. They left me sitting entirely alone at a table set for a romantic anniversary celebration that was actually a funeral for my life. I sat there staring at the $100 bill and the stack of legal papers. The waiter approached cautiously, asking if I still wanted to order dinner. I shook my head, unable to speak. My chest burned with a betrayal so deep and toxic it felt like I was physically suffocating. I had played by the rules my entire life, and I had lost everything to 2 people who had no rules at all. But as I picked up the papers and folded them, a strange and terrifying sense of clarity washed over me. The initial shock began to fade, giving way to a cold and calculated rage. Julian was a flashy real estate developer who cared about image but never read the fine print. Victoria was a ruthless opportunist who thought she held all the winning cards because she struck first. They thought they had left me with absolutely nothing. They thought they had backed a harmless underwriter into a corner he could never escape. They were wrong. They had no idea what they were about to walk into. They had no idea what kind of trap my father had left behind. And they had no idea that the man they just destroyed was about to become their absolute worst nightmare. The neon light outside my window buzzed with a relentless electric hum that felt like a drill against my skull. I woke up staring at a water-stained ceiling that looked nothing like the vaulted architecture of the home I had spent years paying for. The air in the room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial cleaner. It was 6 in the morning. Less than 12 hours ago, I was sitting in a luxury country club celebrating a decade of marriage. Now I was lying on a mattress that sagged in the middle, trying to process the absolute reality that my wife and my own brother had conspired to erase my existence. I sat up and rubbed my eyes, feeling the heavy weight of exhaustion settling deep into my bones. My tailored suit from the night before was draped over a plastic chair in the corner of the room. It was the only clothing I had left to my name. Victoria had made sure the temporary restraining order locked me out of my own closet before I even knew the marriage was over. I reached for my phone on the scratched wooden nightstand. I had one priority before the world woke up and the nightmare continued. I needed to hear the voices of my children. Quinn and Leo were 5,000 miles away at an elite summer language immersion camp in the Bavarian Alps. I had worked double shifts for 6 months to afford the expensive tuition so they could perfect their German and Italian. I dialed the international number and waited as the line clicked and routed across the ocean. When Quinn answered, her voice was bright and full of the innocent joy I was desperately trying to protect. I forced my throat to open and swallowed the panic that was rising in my chest. I spoke to them in fluent German. I told them how much I missed them and asked all about their hiking trip through the mountains. Speaking German was our special family bond, but this morning it served a totally different purpose. It forced me to focus entirely on the vocabulary and the grammar which kept my voice from shaking. If I had spoken English, the cracks in my breaking heart would have bled straight through the phone. Leo took the receiver next and told me excitedly about a castle they had visited that afternoon. I closed my eyes and imagined his wide smile. I told them I loved them more than anything in this world. I promised them everything was perfectly fine at home and that their mother and I were incredibly proud of them. Lying to my children was the hardest thing I had ever done in my 39 years of life, but I knew I had to shield them from the toxic blast radius of Victoria and Julian. I hung up the phone, and the heavy silence of the motel room crashed down on me once again. I was completely alone. I walked into the cramped bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. The mirror reflected a man who looked like he had aged 5 years in a single night, but the initial shock was finally beginning to wear off. In its place, a cold and methodical survival instinct was taking over. I was a senior underwriter for a major commercial insurance firm. My entire career was built on analyzing massive disasters and finding the hidden clauses in complex contracts. Victoria and Julian thought they had engineered the perfect ambush. They assumed I would simply roll over and accept defeat like a broken man, but they forgot that I understood financial systems better than anyone they had ever met. I dried my face with a thin cotton towel and put my wrinkled suit back on. I needed cash immediately. I needed to hire a ruthless lawyer, and I needed to secure whatever financial assets Victoria had not yet reached. I walked out of the cheap motel room into the crisp morning air, ready to assess the damage. I drove my car to the main branch of my bank downtown. My vehicle was the only physical asset they could not take last night because I had the keys safely in my pocket. I parked on the street and waited for the heavy glass doors to unlock at exactly 9 o'clock. I walked straight to the teller counter. I knew the branch manager by name because I had been a loyal customer for over a decade. I handed over my driver license and asked the teller to withdraw $10,000 from our joint savings account to cover emergency legal retainers and basic living expenses. The teller swiped my card and stared intently at her computer screen. Her polite customer service smile suddenly faltered. She typed something else on her keyboard and then looked up at me with genuine discomfort in her eyes. She told me my debit card was declining. I asked her to check the main savings account instead. That was the account where I had deposited my quarterly corporate bonus just 2 days ago. She swallowed hard and turned the computer monitor slightly toward me. The balance was 0. I stood there on the polished marble floor as the blood rushed loudly in my ears. I asked her how that was mathematically possible. I demanded to see the complete transaction history for the last 48 hours. She printed a sheet of paper and slid it nervously across the counter. At 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, just hours before our anniversary dinner, exactly $142,000 had been transferred completely out of the joint accounts. The destination was an external corporate holding company. I recognized the name of the holding company immediately. It was one of Julian's aggressive real estate development entities. Victoria had used a massive legal loophole in our joint banking agreement. Because her name was on the accounts as an equal party, she had the absolute legal right to move the funds without my signature. But she did not just move them to a personal checking account where a divorce court judge could easily freeze them and split them fairly. She had wired the entire liquid net worth of our family directly into Julian's corporate structure as a fabricated vendor payment for luxury interior design consulting. They had effectively laundered my life savings through her business and buried it behind heavy layers of aggressive corporate shielding. The bank manager came over to apologize personally. He explained that because the massive transfer was authorized by a joint account holder and processed before the family court issued any official freezing orders, the bank could not reverse the transaction. I was legally and entirely broke. I had $40 in my wallet and half a tank of gas to my name. They had timed their legal strike with terrifying and flawless precision. Julian had used his high-priced corporate lawyers to draft the transfer documents while Victoria used the family court system to lock me out of my own house. They had executed a coordinated financial slaughter meant to destroy me. I walked out of the bank and stood on the busy city sidewalk as morning commuters rushed past me holding their expensive coffees. The sheer scale of their betrayal was truly breathtaking. They did not just want to start a new glamorous life together. They wanted to ensure I had absolutely no financial resources to fight back. They wanted to leave me utterly destitute, so I could never afford to challenge them for custody of my children. But they had made one critical miscalculation in their grand design. They mistook my responsible and quiet nature for weakness. I got back into my car and drove directly to my office building. I worked on the 22nd floor of a towering glass high-rise in the bustling financial district. I told myself I just needed to get to my desk. I needed to log into my secure terminal and start pulling favors from the corporate attorneys I knew in the building. I could request an emergency payroll advance from Human Resources. I could figure this entire nightmare out. I just needed to maintain my professional composure and keep walking forward. I walked into the grand marble lobby of my building. The morning rush was in full swing. Dozens of my professional colleagues and wealthy clients were waiting by the elevator banks discussing the morning markets and reading the news. I took a deep, calming breath and smoothed my wrinkled suit jacket. I joined the large crowd waiting for the express elevator, trying to blend in. That was when a man in a cheap gray windbreaker stepped directly into my path. He physically blocked me from reaching the elevator doors. He looked closely at my face and then looked down at a metal clipboard he was holding in his hands. He asked loudly if I was Harrison Caldwell. I nodded slowly, feeling a sudden and violent knot twist deep in my stomach. The man thrust a thick stack of heavy legal documents forcefully against my chest. He said the words loud enough for half the crowded lobby to hear. "You have been served." The polite professional chatter around the elevator banks instantly died. My coworkers turned their heads to stare at me in absolute shock. The process server turned on his heel and walked quickly out the revolving glass doors, leaving me standing there holding a massive legal binder like a criminal. My hands physically shook as I read the bold black letters on the cover page. It was a massive civil lawsuit filed in state court. The listed plaintiff was Julian Caldwell. My own brother was suing me. I frantically scanned the first page of the legal complaint as the elevator doors opened and closed without me. Julian was formally suing me for defamation and breach of fiduciary duty. I felt my vision blur as I read his absurd and malicious allegations. He claimed that I had intentionally mismanaged a minor family trust set up by our late grandfather years ago. He claimed I had actively withheld funds and deliberately damaged his professional reputation in the commercial real estate community. It was a complete and total fabrication. The minor trust he was referencing had been legally dissolved 5 years ago with his full notarized consent. But the actual truth did not matter to him at all. The lawsuit was a tactical military strike. Julian knew I had absolutely no money left to hire a civil defense attorney. He knew that by filing a massive multi-million-dollar lawsuit, he would force me into an automatic legal default. It was a paper blizzard designed to bury me alive under a mountain of court fees. He was using his immense wealth and his aggressive lawyers to tie a legal noose around my neck while Victoria held the family court restraining order. They were attacking my life from every conceivable angle. I stood in the corporate lobby, completely humiliated in front of the people I had worked with for 15 years. I could feel their harsh, judgmental stares burning into the back of my neck. I tucked the lawsuit under my arm and finally stepped into an empty elevator car. I leaned my head against the cold metal wall as the car shot upward toward my office. I thought the worst part of the morning was over, but the day was about to deliver one final crushing blow. When the elevator doors opened on my floor, my senior manager was already waiting for me. David was a strict and unforgiving man who cared only about the firm's public reputation and its quarterly stock price. He did not say good morning to me. He did not ask how I was doing or why I looked so exhausted. He simply pointed his finger toward his corner office and told me to sit down immediately. When I walked into his office, the regional director of human resources was already sitting at the long mahogany conference table. My stomach completely dropped. I knew exactly what this meeting was before anyone spoke a single word. David folded his hands on his polished desk and looked at me with cold, professional detachment. He told me that the firm had been officially notified of the temporary restraining order and the highly public civil litigation currently pending against me. Julian's lawyers had deliberately sent copies of the explosive lawsuits directly to my employer, under the false guise of requesting payroll garnishment records. It was a deeply calculated move to completely humiliate me in my professional life and destroy my career. David explained that as a senior commercial underwriter, my job required absolute ethical standing and flawless financial credibility. The firm managed immense financial risk for massive global corporations, and they simply could not have a lead analyst involved in a messy public scandal involving allegations of financial mismanagement and emotional volatility. He said my continued presence was a corporate liability the firm was no longer willing to carry. I desperately pleaded with him. I explained that the allegations were entirely false and fabricated. I told him my wife and my brother had maliciously conspired to steal my assets and ruin my good name. I asked for a temporary unpaid leave of absence to sort the legal mess out. I reminded him of the 15 years of flawless, dedicated service I had given to the company. I reminded him of the millions of dollars in premium accounts I had personally secured for the firm. David just shook his head slowly. He said the executive decision was final and effective immediately. The human resources director slid a standard severance agreement across the table. But because I was being terminated under a strict corporate morality and liability clause, my standard severance pay was suspended pending the final outcome of the civil litigation. They were throwing me out into the street with absolutely nothing to fall back on. 10 minutes later, I was publicly escorted out of the building by a uniformed security guard. I carried a small cardboard box containing a framed photograph of my beautiful children and a ceramic coffee mug. The firm had digitally disabled my security keycard before I even reached the ground floor lobby. I walked out into the harsh, glaring sunlight of the financial district. I had lost my marriage to the woman I loved. I had lost my beautiful home. I had lost my entire life savings. And now I had lost my prestigious career. Julian and Victoria had successfully stripped away every single foundational pillar of my life in less than 24 hours. I was a walking ghost, standing on a busy street corner watching the world move on without me. I put my cardboard box down on a concrete bench and sat beside it, feeling the crushing weight of defeat. I pulled the civil lawsuit out of my jacket pocket and stared at Julian's arrogant looping signature on the bottom page. He really thought he had won the war. He really thought he had left me with absolutely zero leverage to fight back. But as I sat there staring at his forged narrative, a quiet memory pierced through the dense fog of my despair. I thought about the language camp my kids were attending in Europe. I thought about the true importance of family legacy and the lessons my dad taught me. And then I remembered the small, heavy brass key carefully hidden inside the torn lining of my leather briefcase. My father had given me that specific key just 3 days before he died. He made me swear on my life that I would never tell Julian anything about it. He said it was a secret failsafe meant only to protect my children's future if things ever went wrong. It opened a private safety deposit box at a small regional bank in the next county over, a box that Julian and Victoria knew absolutely nothing about. I looked up at the towering glass buildings surrounding me as a slow and calm realization settled over my shattered nerves. My brother thought he had destroyed my entire future by taking my money and ruining my name, but he had just forced me to open the one door he could never access. I picked up my box and walked toward my car with a new sense of purpose. The ambush was finally over. It was time for me to fight back. The morning sun felt blinding and entirely unnatural as I pulled my car onto the interstate highway heading west. The towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district slowly faded in my rearview mirror, looking like a massive corporate graveyard of my 15-year career. Less than an hour ago, I had been publicly escorted out of my own office building by a uniformed security guard. My professional life was completely over. My marriage was a carefully calculated lie. My joint checking and savings accounts were utterly empty. Julian and Victoria had executed a flawless legal and financial slaughter, stripping away every visible asset I possessed. They had timed their strike with the precision of a military operation, hitting me with a fabricated family court restraining order and a massive civil lawsuit on the exact same day. But as my tires hummed against the rough asphalt, my initial panic began to harden into something entirely different. It was cold, sharp, and intensely focused. They thought they had successfully cornered a boring insurance underwriter who only knew how to read spreadsheets and calculate premiums. They completely forgot that my entire professional existence was built on analyzing massive disasters and engineering complex contingencies. And they had absolutely no idea about the heavy brass key resting deep inside the hidden lining of my leather briefcase. My father had given me that specific key just 3 days before a sudden heart attack took his life. He pulled me aside during a quiet Sunday afternoon and made me swear on everything I loved that I would never mention its existence to Julian. My father knew exactly what kind of man my brother was becoming. Julian was a flashy real estate developer who worshipped high-interest leverage, aggressive expansion, and expensive appearances. My father was a quiet, methodical man who valued airtight foundations and absolute long-term security. The brass key belonged to a private safety deposit box at a small regional branch of the First National Bank located entirely in the next county over. It was a financial ghost. It did not exist on any joint tax return, any digital banking app, or any family ledger. It was a fail-safe specifically designed to protect my children if a catastrophe ever struck our family. I thought about my kids, Quinn and Leo, currently thousands of miles away at their European language immersion camp. I had worked double shifts to pay for them to learn German and Italian so they could have a global future. The contents of that steel box were their ultimate safety net. I drove for 45 minutes, my mind racing through the exact legal steps I needed to take the moment I had the documents safely in my hands. The Black Ridge Trust was inside that box. I planned to extract the contents, secure a ruthless civil defense attorney, and completely dismantle Julian's fabricated lawsuit against me piece by piece. I would use the hidden asset to fight for full custody of my kids and leave Victoria with absolutely nothing. I finally pulled into the quiet suburban parking lot of the bank branch. The building was an older, unassuming brick structure far away from the polished marble lobbies Julian frequented. I grabbed my briefcase, smoothed my wrinkled suit jacket, and walked through the heavy double-glass doors. The air conditioning inside the bank was sharp and freezing against my skin. I approached the customer service desk and asked to speak directly with the branch manager. I presented my driver license and pulled the heavy brass key from my briefcase, setting it gently on the polished wooden counter. A young teller directed me to a small, frosted glass office near the main vault. A few moments later, the branch manager walked in. He was an older man named Thomas with thinning gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He politely took my license, looked closely at the brass key, and then typed my name into his secure computer terminal. I sat in the leather chair opposite his desk, my chest tight with anticipation. I was moments away from securing the exact leverage I needed to save my children from Julian's toxic influence. But as Thomas read the information on the screen, his fingers suddenly stopped moving across the keyboard. The polite customer service smile vanished completely from his face. He looked at the computer monitor, looked down at my brass key, and then looked back at me with an expression of sheer confusion and rising panic. He swallowed hard and asked me if there had been some sort of sudden miscommunication within my family regarding the estate administration. I asked him what he was talking about. My voice was completely steady, but a cold spike of adrenaline shot straight into my bloodstream. Thomas turned his monitor slightly toward me, his hands actually shaking. He told me that box number 847 had already been accessed and emptied. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of his wooden desk so hard my knuckles turned white. I told him that was mathematically and physically impossible. I was the primary executor of the estate, and I possessed the only physical key in existence. I had never authorized anyone else to enter that highly secure vault under any circumstances. Thomas took a deep breath and pulled a physical file folder from a locked drawer in his desk. He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a secure access log dated yesterday afternoon, exactly 3 hours before my disastrous anniversary dinner at the country club. And right there, printed clearly on the visitor line, was the name Victoria Caldwell. The air vanished from the small office. I stared at my wife's name written in her elegant, looping handwriting. I demanded to know how a federally regulated bank could possibly allow a woman who was not listed on the private account to bypass security and access a safety deposit box. Thomas looked terrified. He quickly explained that she did not bypass security. She had presented a secondary master key, and more importantly, she had presented a fully executed, notarized, and legally binding durable power of attorney, granting her complete and absolute control over all my financial assets, including the specific safety deposit box in question. I snatched the document from the folder. My eyes aggressively scanned the dense legal phrasing. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney, the exact kind usually reserved for catastrophic medical emergencies or severe cognitive decline. And at the bottom of the very last page, right next to the official raised notary stamp, was my signature. I stared at the blue ink on the white paper. It looked exactly like my signature. The unique loops, the slight slant, the specific pressure of the pen were completely identical to my own hand. It was a flawless, terrifyingly perfect forgery. Victoria was a luxury interior designer who spent her days sketching intricate architectural details and custom furniture by hand. She had spent 10 years of marriage watching me sign checks, mortgage documents, and massive corporate insurance contracts at our kitchen table. She had quietly practiced my signature until she could execute it with the lethal precision of a master criminal. She had secretly hired a corrupt notary from one of Julian's aggressive real estate firms to stamp the document, making it a fully weaponized legal instrument. They had not just ambushed me at the country club. They had not just drained our joint checking accounts through a banking loophole. They had spent months tracking my movements, digging through my private files, and locating this secret regional bank branch. They had orchestrated a total financial annihilation. Julian must have found an old reference to the box in our father's archived tax documents. Victoria used her forged power of attorney to walk right into this bank request a replacement key under the guise of a family emergency, and completely gut the only lifeline I had left in the world. I forced my voice to remain perfectly calm. I asked Thomas what exactly she had removed from the steel box. He nervously consulted the security exit log attached to the file. He told me she had walked out carrying a single thick leather portfolio. The Black Ridge Trust. My vision tunneled as the reality of what they had taken crashed over me. The Black Ridge Trust was not a liquid cash account. It was not a portfolio of stocks or reliable government bonds. It was a physical bearer deed to a massive 300-acre industrial plot of land located in rural Pennsylvania. In the ruthless, fast-paced world of commercial real estate, a bearer deed is a highly unique and incredibly powerful legal instrument. It means whoever physically holds the original paper document owns the property outright. There is no digital registry. There is no mandatory waiting period. Whoever possesses the paper is the absolute undisputed king of the dirt. Julian was a commercial real estate developer. He built his entire flashy empire on finding undervalued properties, ripping them down, and leveraging the raw land for massive, aggressive construction loans. I instantly realized exactly what his master plan was. Julian and Victoria had stolen the bearer deed to actively hide it from the upcoming divorce proceedings. By transferring the physical deed directly into one of Julian's anonymous corporate holding companies, they could completely erase the massive asset from my legal net worth before the family court judge even knew it existed. Julian thought he had just struck the absolute motherlode. He thought he had just stolen 300 acres of prime, unzoned industrial land located directly next to a major interstate highway. In his greedy, arrogant mind, that land was a beautiful blank canvas perfectly ripe for a $20 million commercial logistics center. He probably thought our late father was a complete fool for letting it sit empty and undeveloped for decades. He probably thought I was an absolute idiot for keeping it locked in a dark metal box instead of liquidating it for massive capital gains. They thought they had just stolen the crown jewel of our family legacy, securing their glamorous new life together, while leaving me to rot in a cheap motel room with absolutely nothing. Thomas asked if I wanted him to contact the local police authorities to formally report a domestic theft. He frantically offered to call the bank's internal fraud department to initiate an immediate federal investigation into the notarized document. He was rambling, clearly terrified that a multi-million-dollar liability lawsuit was about to drop directly on his branch and completely ruin his career. I did not answer him. I stood up slowly from the leather chair and asked him to take me directly into the vault. Thomas nervously grabbed his heavy ring of master keys and led me through the thick steel security gate. The massive vault was dead silent, smelling of polished metal and old dry paper. We walked slowly down the long illuminated aisle of numbered metal doors until we reached box 847. The small rectangular door was hanging wide open, exposing the dark, empty space inside. I dropped heavily to my knees on the cold tile floor and stared into the empty void. The leather portfolio was gone. The bearer deed was gone. The absolute last piece of my financial security was entirely gone. Thomas stood nervously behind me, wringing his hands together. He started apologizing profusely, saying he would personally call the federal authorities right this second. He expected me to scream in anger. He expected me to break down, crying over the loss of my family legacy. He expected me to punch the metal wall in a violent fit of absolute despair. Instead, a strange low sound began vibrating deep in my chest. It started as a sharp exhale, and then it slowly grew into a quiet, rhythmic chuckle. I knelt there in the freezing vault, staring into the empty steel box, and I started laughing softly. Thomas took a slow, hesitant step backward. His leather shoes squeaked loudly against the polished floor. He asked me in a shaking voice if I needed immediate medical attention. He looked at me like I had completely lost my mind. He looked at me like the sheer crushing weight of the betrayal had finally shattered my sanity into a million unfixable pieces. But I was not broken. For the first time in 24 hours, the heavy, suffocating fog of panic completely lifted from my brain. My mind became as sharp and perfectly clear as a flawless diamond. I was a senior commercial underwriter. I assessed catastrophic corporate risk for a living. I spent my entire career hunting for the hidden toxic liabilities buried deep inside massive, complex contracts. Julian was a flashy developer who only cared about the surface value and the immediate massive payout. He never read the fine print. And Victoria was a ruthless opportunist who thought stealing a piece of paper automatically made her a millionaire. They were so blinded by their own incredible greed, so unbelievably eager to destroy my life and steal my children's inheritance that they completely bypassed the most basic fundamental rule of commercial real estate due diligence. I stopped laughing and slowly pushed myself up from the cold floor. I brushed the light dust off the knees of my suit pants. I looked at the terrified bank manager, smiled a genuine relaxed smile, and calmly adjusted my tie. "Do not call the police," I whispered, my voice echoing clearly off the cold steel walls. "They have absolutely no idea what they just unleashed." 6 days is 144 hours. That is exactly how long I sat in the shadows and watched the two people I trusted most walk blindly into a financial execution. I lived out of my 4-door sedan, the same car I used to drive my kids to their expensive European language immersion camps, was now my bedroom, my dining room, and my office. The leather seats that used to smell like expensive cologne and luxury perfume now just smelled like stale fast food and damp wool blankets. I parked in the back corner of a 24-hour grocery store lot where the security guards did not care enough to tap on my windows. The nights were brutally cold. I would wake up shivering, my joints aching from sleeping curled up in the back seat. But I did not feel pity for myself. I did not shed a single tear over the massive house I was locked out of or the prestigious career I had just lost. My mind was entirely consumed by a cold, calculating focus. I was a senior commercial underwriter. My entire professional existence was built on investigating the microscopic details of massive corporate liabilities. Julian and Victoria thought they had destroyed me by stealing the Black Ridge Trust deed. They thought they had backed a helpless man into a corner, but they had absolutely no idea that I was simply waiting for the federal trap to spring. I spent the first 2 days establishing a completely new routine. Every single morning at exactly 8 o'clock, I walked into the county clerk records office. It was a massive gray concrete building located right in the center of the city. The air inside always smelled heavily of floor wax and decaying paper. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a low electric hum that gave most people a headache. For me, that hum was the soundtrack of my retaliation. The clerks behind the thick glass windows got to know my face very well over those 6 days. I did not have a computer or access to my corporate software anymore, so I had to do everything the old-fashioned way. I requested massive stacks of public property records, corporate filing history, and federal environmental zoning maps. I sat at a scratched wooden table in the back corner of the archives room, methodically cross-referencing every single shell company my brother Julian had ever registered in the state. Julian was an arrogant real estate developer. He loved hiding his assets behind complex webs of limited liability companies and anonymous holding groups. He thought it made him look like a Wall Street genius. But as an underwriter, I knew exactly how to track the paper trail. I knew his patterns. I knew his preferred legal structures. And I knew exactly which corporate entity he would use to swallow the Black Ridge Trust deed. I spent hours scanning through thick, heavy binders and squinting at glowing microfiche screens. I traced every single dollar he had aggressively leveraged over the past 5 years. I mapped out his entire cross-collateralized real estate empire on cheap yellow legal pads. I realized very quickly that Julian had built his entire glamorous life on a massive house of cards. He was heavily in debt to high-interest private lenders, and his entire portfolio was tied together. If one single property collapsed under a massive liability, his entire empire would completely disintegrate. On the 3rd day of living in my car, I finally found the exact document I was hunting for. I was scrolling through a digital microfiche machine when the property transfer record flashed onto the glowing screen. There it was in bold black ink. Victoria had used her flawless forgery of my signature to transfer the physical bearer deed of the 300-acre Pennsylvania industrial plot. The receiving party was a newly expedited holding company called Apex Horizon Development. I pulled the corporate registry for Apex Horizon and smiled a genuine relaxed smile right there in the quiet archives room. Julian was listed as the sole managing director. He had signed the receiving documents himself. He had officially and legally taken absolute ownership of the land. He had completely bypassed the standard 60-day escrow period and waived all traditional environmental inspections just so he could hide the massive asset from my divorce proceedings. He was so incredibly greedy, so desperate to steal my family legacy that he blinded himself to the most basic fundamental rule of commercial real estate. You never ever put your name on a piece of raw industrial dirt without reading the federal soil reports. I printed a physical copy of the expedited transfer and folded it neatly into my suit jacket pocket. The trap was officially set. The legal mechanism was locked firmly into place. There was absolutely nothing Julian or Victoria could do to reverse the process now. Federal law is incredibly unforgiving when it comes to undocumented toxic liabilities. The rest of the week was simply a waiting game. I spent the 4th and 5th days sitting in a public library reading books about ancient Roman military tactics and global financial history. I drank cheap black coffee from paper cups and watched the rain wash over the busy city streets through the large library windows. I thought about my beautiful children, Quinn and Leo, currently thousands of miles away in the Bavarian Alps. I thought about the phone call I had made to them on the morning of my destruction. I had spoken to them in fluent German to keep my voice from shaking and to shield them from the horrible reality of what their mother had done. I had promised them everything was going to be perfectly fine. That promise was the absolute only thing keeping me breathing. Every hour that ticked by brought me one step closer to securing their future and completely obliterating the people who tried to steal it. On the 6th night, I drove my car up a steep, winding road and parked on a high dirt ridge overlooking the wealthy suburbs. I could see the glowing lights of Julian's massive $3 million estate shining brilliantly in the distance. He was probably throwing a massive, lavish party right now. He was probably drinking expensive imported champagne with my wife, celebrating the total financial and personal annihilation of Harrison Caldwell. They probably thought I was sitting in a gutter somewhere, drowning in absolute misery and begging for a second chance. I reclined my driver's seat, pulled my thin, damp wool blanket all the way up to my chin, and closed my eyes. I slept better that night in the freezing back seat of my sedan than I had in 10 years of sleeping in a custom luxury bed. The 7th day broke with a bright, glaring sunrise that pierced right through my cracked windshield. It was a Tuesday. Exactly 1 week since my 10th wedding anniversary dinner at the Oakwood Country Club. 1 week since Victoria slid those heavy divorce papers across the white linen tablecloth. 1 week since Julian threw a $100 bill at my face and told me to call a cab to a cheap motel. I woke up feeling incredibly calm and terrifyingly focused. My body was extremely stiff, and I desperately needed a hot shower, but my mind was sharper than a razor blade. I walked to a nearby gas station, washed my face in the small, dirty bathroom sink, and bought a stale breakfast pastry with the last few coins in my pocket. I walked back to my car and sat on the hood, watching the morning highway traffic slowly build. I knew the federal enforcement timeline perfectly. Government environmental agencies usually operate on a very strict schedule. They like to execute their high-priority field operations right after the morning rush hour when their targets are relaxed, arrogant, and entirely off guard. At exactly 9:45 in the morning, my cell phone started vibrating aggressively inside my jacket pocket. The sudden loud buzzing sound made my heart skip a single heavy beat. I pulled the phone out and stared at the bright glowing screen. It was not my defense lawyer. It was not the regional bank manager. The caller identification displayed a name I had not seen on my screen since the exact moment my life completely collapsed. Victoria. I let the phone ring 3 separate times. I wanted her to feel the rising, suffocating panic. I wanted her to stare at her phone, praying that the man she had just completely destroyed would actually pick up the call. On the 4th ring, I slid my thumb slowly across the glass screen and pressed the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I did not say a single word. I just listened to the heavy, frantic breathing on the other end of the line. The arrogant, cold woman from the country club was completely gone. The ruthless opportunist who had stared me dead in the eye and told me I was a boring failure was entirely erased. In her place was a terrified, trembling voice that sounded like it was drowning in absolute panic and sheer terror. "Save me, Harrison." Her voice broke into a violent, uncontrollable sob. The terrible sound echoed through the small speaker of my phone. She was gasping for air, unable to string a complete logical sentence together. "Please, you have to save me." Julian found the papers. "He is destroying the house. He says we are dead." I sat on the cold metal hood of my car, perfectly still. The morning highway breeze rushed past my ears, but all I could hear was the beautiful, magnificent sound of their total destruction. I asked her what she was talking about. I kept my voice entirely flat, completely emotionless, and entirely detached. I sounded exactly like a corporate underwriter reading a dry, boring insurance policy. "He is tearing his home office apart!" Victoria cried, her voice escalating into a hysterical, ear-piercing shriek. He got a massive certified legal letter in the mail this morning. He opened it, and his face turned completely white. He started screaming at me, Harrison. He threw a heavy crystal vase at the wall and shattered it. He is saying the Blackridge Trust is highly toxic. He is saying the federal government is going to take absolutely everything we own. You have to help me right now. I am so unbelievably scared of him. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp morning air. The final pieces of my trap were finally locking firmly into place. I asked her a very simple, direct question. My tone was casual, like I was asking a stranger for the time of day. Did you file the bearer deed under Julian Holding Company like I assume you did? There was a long, agonizing moment of silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the loud sound of heavy footsteps and expensive glass shattering in the background. Julian was clearly losing his absolute mind inside his massive, luxurious mansion. Yes, Victoria sobbed loudly. We fast-tracked the deed transfer the exact same day I took it from your safety deposit box. We pushed it through the county office immediately to hide the massive asset from the divorce judge. We put it under Apex Horizon. Why does that matter, Harrison? What is happening right now? Why is he saying we owe $35 million to the government? I closed my eyes and let the warmth of the morning sun hit my face. The absolute perfection of their incredible greed was truly breathtaking. They had executed my exact legal plan without me having to lift a single finger. They had maliciously stolen a massive toxic liability and legally bound it directly to their own necks. They thought they were stealing a gold mine, but they had actually swallowed a ticking financial bomb. Harrison, please, you have to tell me what to do, Victoria begged. Her voice was growing more frantic and desperate by the second. The loud, aggressive sound of heavy sirens suddenly began wailing loudly in the background of the call. The high-pitched mechanical screams were approaching her exact location very fast. Harrison, the FBI is here, Victoria screamed at the top of her lungs. There are large black government vehicles crashing through the front security gates. There are federal agents in tactical gear swarming the entire driveway. They are carrying heavy weapons. Julian is running toward the back door like a coward. What do I do? Please tell me what to do. I lowered the phone slightly from my ear. I could hear the aggressive, violent pounding on her thick, custom wooden front doors. I could hear the federal agents shouting strict authoritative commands over heavy electronic bullhorns. The massive raid was fully underway. They were about to seize every single asset Julian owned. They were about to freeze all of his corporate accounts, including the money Victoria had maliciously stolen from me. Their glamorous, exciting new life together was officially over. I brought the phone back to my mouth. I did not raise my voice in anger. I did not yell. I just spoke with absolute quiet finality. I highly recommend you comply with the federal agents, Victoria. Have a wonderful rest of your life. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to end the call immediately. The digital screen went entirely black. The frantic screaming was instantly cut off, replaced by the peaceful, relaxing silence of the empty gas station parking lot. I slipped the phone back into my suit jacket pocket and slid off the hood of my car. The silence was finally broken. The long, terrible week of waiting was officially over. The trap was completely sprung, and it was finally time for me to go watch the show. The steering wheel of my car felt rough under my hands as I pulled out of the gas station parking lot and merged onto the highway. The morning traffic was beginning to thin out, leaving the open road stretching ahead of me like a long gray ribbon. For the first time in an entire week, I was not driving aimlessly. I had a very specific destination. I was heading toward the exclusive gated communities of the northern hills where massive estates sat behind high brick walls and wrought iron gates. I was driving toward Julian and his $3 million mansion. The sun was climbing higher in the clear blue sky, warming the cold interior of my vehicle. The panic that Victoria had projected through the phone just minutes ago was still ringing pleasantly in my ears. She was terrified. She was begging for the husband she had thrown away to somehow save her from the monster she had chosen. But I was not driving up there to save anyone. I was driving up there to witness the absolute perfection of their self-destruction. To understand the sheer magnitude of the trap Julian had just sprung on himself, you have to understand the true nature of the Blackridge Trust. Julian and Victoria believed they had stolen a pristine 300-acre plot of unzoned commercial dirt. They looked at the location on a map. They saw its proximity to the interstate highway, and their greedy minds immediately painted a picture of a $20 million logistics center. Julian was a flashy real estate developer who operated entirely on surface-level appearances. He saw a massive piece of undeveloped land and assumed our father was simply too conservative and too frightened of the modern market to capitalize on it. He assumed I was keeping the bearer deed locked in a dark safety deposit box because I was a boring insurance underwriter who lacked the killer instinct to flip it for a massive profit. They were both completely and utterly wrong. The Blackridge property was not a gold mine. It was a staggering toxic nightmare. When our father bought that land decades ago, he was a young, ambitious man trying to build a solid foundation for his family. He purchased the acreage for pennies on the dollar from a bankrupt manufacturing conglomerate. But this was back in the late 70s, before the government began aggressively regulating industrial waste. My father did not know that the previous owners had spent 30 years using the back half of the property as an unregulated chemical dumping ground. The soil was completely saturated with heavy metals, volatile organic compounds, and incredibly toxic industrial solvents. The groundwater beneath the surface was effectively poisoned. By the time the federal government stepped in and mapped out the contaminated zones across the country, the Blackridge land was officially designated as a catastrophic environmental hazard. When my father finally discovered the horrifying truth about the land he had purchased, it nearly broke his heart. He realized the property was entirely worthless for development. But because he had bought it prior to the establishment of the modern environmental enforcement laws, and because he had absolutely no part in the actual dumping of the toxic chemicals, the federal government granted him a very specific legal shield. Under the law, he was classified as an innocent landowner. He was grandfathered into a protective clause that legally shielded him from the massive financial burden of cleaning up the toxic waste. The government basically agreed to leave him alone as long as he never tried to develop the land and never disturbed the poisoned soil. But that grandfather clause had one massive absolute condition. It was entirely untransferable. My father gave me a piece of a father's advice before he died. He told me that true wealth is not about what you can aggressively acquire, but about what you can successfully protect. He knew that Julian possessed a dangerous combination of massive ego and terrifying financial recklessness. He knew Julian would eventually destroy himself if he was given access to the wrong kind of leverage. That is why my father entrusted the secret of the Blackridge deed entirely to me. He wanted me to hold it as a physical test. He knew that one day Julian might try to take everything from me. He knew I needed a weapon of last resort. I wanted to pass that same deep wisdom down to my own children. It is the exact reason I invested every spare dollar I had into their education. I paid for Quinn and Leo to attend those expensive European immersion camps, not just to learn German and Italian, but to understand the world beyond their immediate surroundings. I even spent hours every single weekend teaching them Mandarin at our kitchen table. I knew Mandarin is the language of the future, and I wanted my kids to possess the global foresight that Julian completely lacked. I wanted them to look beneath the surface of things. Julian never looked beneath the surface. He only cared about the glossy reflection staring back at him in the mirror. And that brings us to the fatal mistake my brother made. When Victoria used her flawless forgery of my signature to access my safety deposit box, she physically stole the bearer deed. She handed that piece of paper to Julian like it was a winning lottery ticket. In his desperate rush to hide the massive asset from my divorce proceedings, Julian completely bypassed every single standard commercial real estate protocol. He did not order a soil test. He did not request a historical environmental survey. He did not wait for the standard 60-day escrow period where these massive liabilities are usually uncovered by municipal inspectors. He was so incredibly arrogant and so blindingly greedy that he simply fast-tracked the transfer and filed the deed directly under his own primary holding company, Apex Horizon Development. The moment his expensive corporate lawyers stamped that transfer and registered the deed with the county, Julian legally shattered the innocent landowner defense. The grandfather clause evaporated the exact second the property changed hands. As a senior commercial underwriter, I have spent my entire 15-year career assessing catastrophic risk. I know the federal environmental statutes better than most practicing attorneys. The law governing this specific type of toxic land is known as the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. Most people in the commercial sector simply call it the Superfund Law. And the Superfund Law is the most terrifying, unforgiving piece of financial legislation in the entire country. Under this specific federal law, liability is strict joint and several. That means the government does not care if you were the one who originally dumped the toxic chemicals. They do not care if you bought the land entirely by accident. If your name is currently on the property deed, you are absolutely and entirely responsible for 100% of the environmental cleanup costs. There are no limits. There are no bankruptcy protections that can easily wash it away. The federal government will aggressively seize every single asset you own to pay for the remediation. The current estimated cost to dredge the poisoned soil and filter the toxic groundwater at the Black Ridge site was officially calculated at $35 million. Julian did not just steal a piece of empty land. He legally volunteered to pay the United States government $35 million in immediate cash. And because he had transferred the deed directly into Apex Horizon Development, he had cross-collateralized the toxic debt with his entire real estate empire. Apex Horizon was the central financial pillar holding up his luxury apartment buildings, his commercial strip malls, and his $3 million personal mansion. By tying the Black Ridge deed to his primary company, Julian had just infected his entire glamorous life with a lethal financial virus. The federal government was not going to send him a polite warning letter. They were going to drop a $35 million federal lien on his head and immediately seize every single bank account, vehicle, and property associated with his name to secure the debt. When I sat in that cheap motel room a week ago, dialing the international number to speak to my children, I felt like a failure. I had spent my entire adult life trying to be the reliable foundation for my family. I emptied my retirement accounts to save Victoria's luxury interior design business because I believed in the sacred promise of marriage. I believed that when your partner stumbles, you sacrifice your own balance to keep them standing. Victoria took my sacrifice and weaponized it. She looked at my stability and called it boring. She looked at my dedication and called it weakness. She wanted the thrill and the glamour that Julian projected. But Julian's glamour was an illusion built on toxic debt. And Victoria was about to learn a very painful lesson about the difference between a man who builds a solid foundation and a man who builds a house on poisoned dirt. The money Victoria had stolen from our joint savings account, the $142,000 she had wired out just hours before handing me the divorce papers, was also gone. She had transferred that money directly into Apex Horizon Development, framing it as a vendor payment for luxury consulting. She thought she was brilliantly hiding my life savings behind Julian's corporate shield. She thought she was securing her glamorous new life. But by placing my stolen money into the exact same holding company that now owned the Black Ridge toxic liability, she had legally tied her own stolen funds to the federal debt. The government does not negotiate when it comes to Superfund recovery. The moment the $35 million liability was triggered, federal auditors instantly locked down every single account connected to Apex Horizon. Victoria could not withdraw a single penny. Her interior design business, which she had legally intertwined with Julian's real estate firm to facilitate the money laundering, was now subject to immediate federal seizure. By trying to steal my past, she had completely obliterated her own future. I turned my steering wheel and guided my car up the steep, winding road that led into his exclusive neighborhood. The large manicured lawns and towering oak trees looked incredibly peaceful in the mid-morning light. I drove past a private tennis court and a sprawling golf course. The air up here felt entirely different from the cheap gas station parking lot where I had woken up just a few hours ago. I felt an overwhelming sense of calm washing over me. I was not angry anymore. The burning toxic rage that had consumed my chest during that horrible anniversary dinner was completely gone. In its place was a cold, clinical satisfaction. I finally reached the end of the long, sweeping road and saw the massive wrought iron security gates that protected Julian's estate. The mansion sat far back on the property, an enormous stone structure with towering windows and a perfectly paved circular driveway. I pulled my car over to the side of the road, parking directly under the thick shade of a large weeping willow tree. I rolled my window down, letting the crisp morning air fill the cabin of my car. I turned the engine off and sat in the quiet silence, watching the front gates. Victoria had screamed through the phone that Julian was tearing the house apart. I could easily picture him inside that massive stone mansion, his expensive custom-tailored suit discarded on the floor, his perfect hair a total mess. I could imagine the sheer blood-draining terror on his face when he opened that certified letter from the Environmental Protection Agency and realized that his entire empire was completely gone. All his high-interest loans, all his aggressive leverage, all his arrogant bragging at the country club meant absolutely nothing now. He had built a fortress out of matchsticks, and he had just handed the federal government the match. I checked the clock on my dashboard. It was exactly 10:15 in the morning. I leaned back against the headrest and waited. I did not have to wait very long. The quiet serenity of the wealthy neighborhood was suddenly shattered by the aggressive roaring sound of heavy diesel engines. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw a massive convoy turning onto the street. There were no flashing police lights and no loud screaming sirens. This was not a local police matter. This was a coordinated federal enforcement operation, and they moved with terrifying military precision. 3 large black sport utility vehicles with dark-tinted windows led the convoy. They were immediately followed by 2 heavy enforcement trucks bearing the official seal of the Environmental Protection Agency and the United States Marshals Service. The vehicles did not slow down to admire the manicured lawns. They accelerated aggressively down the street, aiming directly for Julian's estate. I watched in absolute fascination as the lead vehicle reached the front of the mansion. The driver did not stop to press the intercom button. He did not wait for Julian to politely open the gate. The heavy, reinforced bumper of the black federal vehicle slammed violently into the center of the wrought iron security gates. The massive metal doors buckled and tore completely off their brick hinges with a deafening screech that echoed through the entire neighborhood. The convoy swarmed through the broken entrance, pouring into the circular driveway like a flood of dark water. Dozens of federal agents wearing heavy tactical vests poured out of the vehicles before they even came to a complete stop. They were carrying thick metal clipboards, heavy seizing equipment, and tactical rifles. They spread out rapidly, forming a tight, secure perimeter around the entire property. The heavy front doors of the mansion were thrown wide open, and the armed marshals stormed directly into the house. I sat perfectly still in my car, watching the ultimate consequence of their betrayal unfold right in front of my eyes. Julian and Victoria had tried to bury me alive. They had stolen my money, my home, and my career. But greed is completely blind. They had dug their own financial grave, and now the federal government was throwing them inside. The heavy thud of tactical boots hitting the pavement echoed like a relentless drumbeat across the manicured lawns of the exclusive neighborhood. I sat perfectly still inside my parked car beneath the thick, hanging branches of a massive willow tree. The air in the cabin was cool and silent, contrasting violently with the absolute chaos erupting just 50 yards away. The federal government had arrived at my brother's $3 million estate, and they did not come to politely ask questions. The coordinated raid was a masterclass in swift, absolute destruction. 3 heavily armored sport utility vehicles were parked aggressively at sharp angles across the circular driveway, completely blocking any possible exit. The massive custom wrought iron security gates that Julian loved to brag about at family dinners were currently lying twisted and broken on the expensive imported cobblestones. More than 24 federal agents wearing dark tactical vests with bright yellow lettering swarmed the massive property, moving with terrifying military precision. Federal enforcement agencies do not care about expensive Italian marble floors or custom silk curtains. They do not care that you are an elite member of the local country club. When they execute a seizure order based on a $35 million Superfund toxic liability, they dismantle your entire life down to the bare wooden studs. I watched through my windshield as 2 armed marshals stood guard at the shattered front entrance, while a steady stream of forensic accountants and field agents marched into the grand foyer, carrying thick, heavy plastic storage bins. Julian had built his entire flashy real estate empire on the illusion of untouchable wealth, but that illusion was currently being packed into cardboard boxes and carried out into the bright morning sunlight. I rolled my window down just an inch to hear the sounds of the raid more clearly. The neighborhood, which was usually filled with the quiet humming of luxury landscaping equipment and expensive foreign cars, was now dominated by the aggressive shouting of federal officers securing the perimeter. My brother had always believed that the rules simply did not apply to him. He thought his expensive corporate lawyers and his aggressive high-interest loans made him a king. But as I sat there watching agents confiscate his files, I thought about the true meaning of legacy. I thought about my children who were currently thousands of miles away in Europe. My kids are brilliantly trilingual. They already read, write, and speak English, Italian, and German with incredible fluency. I even pushed them to learn Mandarin because I knew Mandarin is the language of the future. I spent countless hours teaching them how to communicate across borders so they could understand the deeper complexities of the world. I wanted them to build lives based on genuine solid substance. Julian spent his entire life building a shallow, fragile empire based entirely on smoke and mirrors. Now the toxic wind was finally blowing it all away. A loud mechanical grinding noise drew my attention toward the massive 4-car garage attached to the side of the mansion. A large commercial flatbed tow truck was slowly backing up the steep driveway, its yellow warning lights flashing brightly against the stone architecture. 2 federal agents walked into the open garage, and a few moments later they pushed Julian's pristine, brand-new Porsche out onto the driveway. The car was his ultimate pride and joy. It was the physical manifestation of his massive ego. He used to park it right in the front of our favorite restaurants, just so everyone could see exactly how much money he was making. I watched with absolute quiet satisfaction as a heavy steel chain was wrapped securely around the front axle of the expensive sports car. The winch whined loudly as the vehicle was dragged forcefully up onto the flatbed, completely scratched and permanently seized by the United States government. The Porsche was no longer a status symbol. It was now just a tiny depreciating asset meant to cover a fraction of a percent of his massive federal debt. Suddenly, the heavy custom oak front doors of the mansion burst wide open. Julian stumbled out onto the grand stone porch looking like a man who had just been thrown entirely into a nightmare. His appearance was completely shocking. The golden child of the Caldwell family, the man who never left the house without a perfectly tailored custom Italian suit and flawless hair, looked utterly destroyed. He was wearing wrinkled sweatpants and a torn undershirt. His face was completely drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of ash gray. He was sweating profusely, and his eyes were wide with a frantic, terrified panic. 2 federal agents followed closely behind him, holding thick stacks of officially stamped legal documents. They were not arresting him physically, but they were doing something much worse. They were legally stripping him of every single thing he owned in the world. Julian looked wildly around his beautiful front yard. He saw the broken security gates. He saw the tactical vehicles parked on his manicured grass. He saw the tow truck strapping down his precious Porsche. He raised his hands to his head and let out a raw, agonizing scream that echoed down the entire wealthy street. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated financial agony. He paced back and forth on the expensive stone porch, looking desperately for a way out of a trap that had no exit doors. Then his frantic eyes scanned the street beyond the property line. He looked past the tactical vehicles and the armed guards. His gaze swept across the tree line and suddenly locked directly onto my sedan parked quietly in the shadows of the willow tree. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the exact moment his brain processed that I was sitting there. I could see the terrifying realization wash over him. He realized that the boring insurance underwriter, the brother he had mocked and discarded like absolute garbage, was sitting in the front row watching his total annihilation. Julian completely lost his mind. He let out a furious, animalistic roar and charged directly off the front porch. He did not care about the armed federal agents standing in his yard. He did not care about the heavy tactical weapons slung across their chests. He sprinted frantically across the expensive custom paving stones, his bare feet slapping loudly against the hard surface. He was pointing his finger aggressively at my car, screaming my name at the top of his lungs. He wanted to rip me out of the driver's seat and tear me apart with his bare hands. He wanted to blame me for the catastrophic mistake that his own endless greed had caused, but he never even made it to the sidewalk. The federal marshals did not hesitate for a single second. When a suspect charges aggressively toward an unsecured perimeter during a high-level federal seizure, the protocol is immediate and physically absolute. 2 massive agents stepped directly into Julian's path. One agent grabbed him by the shoulder while the other swept his legs completely out from under him. Julian hit the ground incredibly hard. The heavy impact forced the air out of his lungs in a loud, violent gasp. The agents immediately pinned him face down into the wet morning grass, pressing their heavy tactical boots firmly against his spine. They twisted his arms painfully behind his back, completely neutralizing the threat. The golden boy of the commercial real estate world was now eating dirt on his own front lawn, pinned down like a common street criminal. That was the exact moment Victoria slowly walked out onto the grand front porch. She was wearing a highly expensive silk designer robe that was loosely tied around her waist. Her perfect hair was a messy, tangled disaster, and her hands were physically shaking as she clutched the stone railing for support. She looked completely undone. The arrogant, cold, and calculated woman who had slid divorce papers across our anniversary dinner table just 7 days ago was entirely gone. She stared in absolute horror as the man she had betrayed me for was brutally restrained on the grass. Julian twisted his neck, straining against the heavy pressure of the federal agent holding him down. He looked up at Victoria standing safely on the porch, and his face twisted into a mask of pure, absolute hatred. He did not ask her if she was okay. He did not ask for her help. He blamed her for the entire collapse of his universe. "You ruined everything!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with intense rage and pure desperation. "You brought the federal government directly into my primary holding company. You put that toxic land into Apex Horizon. You completely cross-collateralized my entire life." Victoria shook her head, tears streaming rapidly down her pale face. She tried to speak, but only a pathetic broken sob came out. She had stolen the physical bearer deed from my private safety deposit box, thinking it was a $20 million gold mine. She had aggressively pushed it through the county office using a flawless forged signature to secure her glamorous new life. She had no idea she was handing him a $35 million bomb. "Every single property I own is tied to that central company," Julian yelled, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet morning air. The Superfund liability just triggered immediate default clauses on all my commercial loans. The banks are pulling their funding right now. The government is seizing all the liquid cash. We owe $35 million in immediate federal fines. We are entirely bankrupt, Victoria. We have absolutely nothing left. Victoria stood completely frozen on the beautiful stone porch as the devastating reality finally washed over her face. The $142,000 she had maliciously stolen from my life savings and wired directly into Julian's corporate accounts was gone forever. Her luxury interior design business, which she had legally intertwined with his real estate empire, was now fully exposed to the massive federal lien. She had thrown away a husband who emptied his retirement accounts to save her dreams, and she had traded him for a flashy, arrogant man who was currently pinned to the dirt with $0 to his name. She sank slowly to her knees on the hard stone porch, burying her face in her trembling hands and weeping uncontrollably. As the chaotic screaming match echoed across the otherwise quiet suburban street, I noticed a dark shadow fall across my driver's side window. I turned my head slowly. A tall federal agent wearing a heavy dark jacket and dark sunglasses was standing directly outside my car door. His hand was resting casually but firmly on his utility belt near his weapon. He had seen Julian screaming my name and charging toward my vehicle. The agent tapped twice on my glass window with a thick knuckle indicating for me to roll it all the way down. The agent did not raise his voice, but his tone was incredibly sharp and entirely absolute. He asked me to state my business in the neighborhood and demanded to see a valid piece of government identification immediately. I did not argue, complain, or hesitate. I maintained perfect professional composure. I reached calmly into my suit jacket pocket, pulled out my worn leather wallet, and retrieved my state-issued driver license. I handed it through the open window, offering him a polite, respectful nod. I knew exactly what was about to happen. The agent took the small plastic card and stared at it for a long moment. He pulled a heavy encrypted radio from his tactical vest and quietly called my full legal name and date of birth into the Federal Dispatch Center. I sat perfectly still, watching his face as he listened to the voice in his earpiece. I knew what the federal database was telling him. It was telling him that Harrison Caldwell had absolutely zero legal connection to Apex Horizon Development. It was telling him that I was currently the listed victim of a massive, highly public civil lawsuit filed by the very man currently eating dirt on the lawn. It was telling him that I had been legally locked out of my own finances by a temporary family court restraining order, heavily proving that I had absolutely no physical access or administrative control over the forged corporate transfer that triggered the raid. The agent reached a completely logical law enforcement conclusion. I was just a bitter, estranged family member who had driven up the hill to quietly watch his terrible brother finally get what he deserved. The agent lowered his radio and looked at me through his dark sunglasses. The tense, aggressive posture in his shoulders completely relaxed. He reached through the open window and handed my driver license back to me. "We have a highly volatile federal situation contained here today. Mr. Caldwell?" The agent said, his voice noticeably softer now, holding a faint trace of genuine sympathy. "I strongly suggest you clear the area and let us finish doing our job." "Have a very good morning, sir." I took my license and slid it safely back into my wallet. I looked the federal agent directly in the eye and offered a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, officer," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. "I believe you are doing a truly excellent job today." I rolled my window up, sealing out the loud, frantic screams still coming from the front lawn. I put my car into drive, took my foot off the brake, and slowly pulled away from the curb. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. I drove quietly down the beautiful winding road, leaving the absolute wreckage of their incredible greed entirely behind me. 2 days is exactly 48 hours. That is exactly how long my brother Julian sat inside a cold, concrete federal holding cell before his high-priced corporate lawyers finally managed to secure his bail. During those 2 days, I did not celebrate. I did not throw a lavish party or drink expensive imported champagne. I simply went about the quiet, methodical business of rebuilding my life from the absolute bottom. I rented a small, modest apartment on the edge of town, using the last few $100s I had borrowed from a trusted college friend. I bought a cheap coffee maker and a thin mattress. I called my children Quinn and Leo at their language camp in Europe. I spoke to them in Italian this time, carefully testing their vocabulary and listening to the innocent joy in their voices. They had absolutely no idea that their entire world had shattered and reformed while they were busy hiking the beautiful Bavarian Alps. I intended to keep it that way until I had secured every single piece of their future permanently. On the morning of the 3rd day, I walked into a local diner called Red Lines. It was a gritty working-class establishment located entirely on the opposite side of the city from the Oakwood Country Club where my marriage had violently ended just over a week ago. The diner smelled of burnt bacon, heavy industrial degreaser, and strong, bitter black coffee. The red vinyl booths were cracked and heavily faded by the sun. The waitresses called everyone honey, and the patrons were mostly tired truck drivers and off-duty police officers finishing their night shifts. It was a place built for people who worked hard with their hands and understood the absolute value of a hard-earned dollar. It was the exact kind of place Julian would absolutely despise. That is exactly why I chose to eat my breakfast there. I was halfway through a plate of scrambled eggs when the small brass bell above the front glass door chimed loudly. I did not have to turn my head to know who had just walked out of the cold morning rain. I could feel his desperate, chaotic energy completely infect the room. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee and waited. Heavy, frantic footsteps approached my booth. Julian slid into the cracked vinyl seat directly across from me. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of us said a single word. I simply sat there and studied the physical ruin of the man who used to be my brother. The transformation was truly staggering. The golden child of the Caldwell family, the flashy commercial real estate developer who used to wear custom-tailored Italian suits and a $50,000 watch, was entirely gone. In his place sat a hollow, desperate shell of a man. His expensive haircut was matted and greasy from the rain and the institutional holding cell. He was wearing a cheap gray hooded sweatshirt that looked like it had been handed to him by a sympathetic bail bondsman. His skin was a sickly pale gray, and his hands were physically trembling as he rested them on the sticky diner table. He smelled of stale sweat, cheap institutional soap, and overwhelming absolute panic. He did not look like a king anymore. He looked like a cornered rat. Julian reached inside the front pocket of his damp sweatshirt and pulled out a thick, folded piece of heavy legal paper. He slammed it down onto the table with a violent smack that caused my coffee cup to rattle aggressively against the porcelain saucer. Several tired truck drivers sitting at the counter turned their heads to look at us, but I kept my eyes locked entirely on his face. "Sign it," Julian demanded. His voice was completely raw and raspy, like he had spent the last 48 hours screaming at the cold federal walls. I looked down at the crumpled document. It was a retroactive legal affidavit. I did not need to read the dense fine print to know exactly what his desperate corporate lawyers had drafted in the middle of the night. The document was a fabricated confession. It stated that the transfer of the Black Ridge Trust bearer deed was a massive administrative mistake. It stated that I, Harrison Caldwell, had never intended to relinquish the physical asset, and that Apex Horizon Development had received the toxic property through a clerical error. It was a legally binding attempt to push the $35 million Superfund environmental liability directly back onto my shoulders. I looked back up at Julian. I did not yell. I did not show an ounce of anger or intimidation. I just stared at him with cold, clinical detachment. "I am not signing anything, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly steady and incredibly quiet. Julian leaned aggressively across the table. His bloodshot eyes were wide and frantic. His breath smelled acidic and sour. "You have to sign it, Harrison. Do you have any idea what they are doing to me right now? The federal government has completely frozen every single bank account I have ever touched. The Environmental Protection Agency has seized all of my commercial properties. My private investors are pulling their funding and threatening to sue me for criminal fraud. The banks are foreclosing on the mansion this afternoon because my loans are entirely cross-collateralized. I have absolutely nothing left. You set me up. You intentionally let me take that toxic land." I picked up my coffee cup and took another slow, measured sip. The hot liquid warmed my throat. I set the cup down carefully, ensuring it did not make a single sound against the saucer. "I did not set you up, Julian. I did not forge my own signature on a fake power of attorney. I did not walk into my own private safety deposit box and maliciously steal a physical bearer deed to hide it from a family court judge. I did not fast-track a massive commercial property transfer without ordering a basic environmental soil test. You and Victoria did all of those things completely on your own. You built your own execution chamber. You tied the rope yourself. All I did was stand back and let you pull the lever. Julian slammed his fists onto the table again. His face turned a violent shade of dark purple. You are going to take this liability back, Harrison. If you do not sign this paper right now, I swear to God I will drag our entire family name through the absolute mud. I will go to the press. I will tell the local news that our father was a criminal who intentionally hoarded toxic industrial waste. I will tell them you are a corrupt insurance underwriter who orchestrated a massive federal fraud scheme. I will completely ruin you. I will make sure you never work in the financial sector again. And I will make sure your precious children know exactly what kind of monster you really are. He was panting heavily now, his chest heaving with desperate exertion. He thought his threats still carried weight. He thought he could still intimidate me by attacking my professional reputation and my family. He completely failed to understand that the man sitting across from him had already survived the absolute worst he had to offer. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, bridging the physical distance between us. I lowered my voice until it was a harsh whisper that cut straight through the ambient noise of the diner. You cannot ruin me, Julian, because you already tried. You and Victoria took my home. You drained my life savings. You filed a fabricated restraining order to lock me away from my own children. You filed a massive, baseless civil lawsuit that cost me my 15-year career. You tried to erase my existence completely so you could live in a glamorous fantasy world built on stolen money. You have absolutely no leverage left. Your threats are as empty as your bank accounts. Julian stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He was waiting for me to show some sign of weakness, some lingering brotherly guilt that he could easily exploit. But there was absolutely nothing left for him to harvest. Let me explain exactly why you lost everything, Julian. I continued dissecting his entire life with the precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. You have always believed that you are the smartest person in every single room. You worshipped appearances. You thought buying a $3 million mansion and driving a custom Porsche made you a titan of industry. But you never actually understood the foundation of true wealth. True wealth is not about what you can aggressively acquire. It is about what you can successfully protect. I pointed a finger at the crumpled legal document resting between us. When you saw that bearer deed, you were completely blinded by your own incredible arrogance. You saw 300 acres of raw land, and your greedy mind instantly calculated $20 million of pure commercial profit. You were so eager to steal my legacy that you bypassed the most fundamental rule of commercial real estate. Any first-year financial analyst knows you never transfer an unzoned industrial property without a Phase 1 environmental report. But you thought the rules did not apply to you. You thought you could just outsmart the federal system like you always do. Julian shook his head frantically, tears of absolute frustration welling up in his bloodshot eyes. It was a mistake. It was just a stupid oversight. Victoria told me the land was clean. She told me it was a gold mine. Do not blame Victoria for your own blinding greed. I interrupted, my tone sharp and unforgiving. Victoria is a ruthless opportunist, but you are the sole managing director of Apex Horizon Development. You put your own signature on the transfer documents. You cross-collateralized your entire real estate empire with a piece of poisoned dirt. You swallowed a $35 million federal superfund liability because you were too arrogant to read the fine print. You did this to yourself, Julian. The harsh reality of his situation finally seemed to crush the last remaining breath out of his lungs. He slumped back against the red vinyl booth, looking completely defeated. The federal agents told me the cleanup costs are strictly enforced, he whispered, staring blankly at the table. They are going to take my future earnings. They are going to garnish my wages for the rest of my natural life. I am going to prison for criminal negligence, Harrison. I am going to federal prison. I watched him crumble and felt absolutely no pity. I thought about the phone call I had to make to my kids from a cheap motel room. I thought about the sheer terror of not knowing how I was going to pay for their global education because my own blood had robbed me blind. Our father always knew what you were, Julian. That is exactly why he left the Black Ridge Trust entirely in my care. He knew your greed would eventually consume you. He gave me that key to protect the family from you, and he was absolutely right. Julian's eyes suddenly snapped up. The crushing despair vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden explosive surge of violent, toxic rage. The realization that our late father had intentionally protected me and fundamentally distrusted him was the final psychological blow. His fragile, massive ego shattered completely into a million unfixable pieces. "You boring, pathetic loser," Julian screamed at the top of his lungs. His voice cracked violently, echoing off the walls of the small diner. Before I could even blink, Julian launched his entire body across the narrow table. He lunged at me with a wild, desperate swing, aiming his closed fist directly at my face. He wanted to physically break me. He wanted to wipe the calm, steady expression off my face with pure brute force. But I was not the same man who sat frozen at the country club a week ago. I was not the quiet, submissive brother who just absorbed his abuse. My reflexes were sharp, entirely fueled by the cold clarity of my survival. As his fist swung toward my jaw, I did not flinch. I did not pull back. I simply raised my left arm and caught his wrist in midair. I gripped his forearm with a crushing, unyielding force, stopping his physical attack completely dead in its tracks. The sudden heavy impact rattled the coffee cups on the table, but I did not move a single inch. Julian gasped in pain as my fingers dug deeply into his wrist. He tried to pull his arm back, but he was completely trapped. He was weak, exhausted, and entirely broken. I was grounded solid and completely immovable. We stayed locked in that violent, rigid pose for 3 long seconds. The entire diner had gone dead silent. The truck drivers at the counter had stood up ready to intervene, but they stopped when they saw that I had the situation under absolute total control. I looked directly into my brother, terrified, pathetic eyes. I let him feel the sheer physical strength of the man he had spent his entire life underestimating. I let him understand that he could never hurt me again. I slowly and forcefully shoved his arm backward, throwing him back into his side of the vinyl booth. Julian hit the back cushion hard, rubbing his wrist and breathing in ragged, heavy gasps. He looked at me with absolute sheer terror. He finally realized that he was staring at a brick wall that he could never ever break down. I calmly adjusted the cuffs of my shirt. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a crisp $10 bill. I placed it neatly on the table right next to his fabricated, worthless legal document. It was more than enough to cover my black coffee and my scrambled eggs. I slid out of the booth and stood up, towering over him as he sat shivering in his cheap, damp sweatshirt. I looked down at the man who had tried to destroy my life, my family, and my future. I had absolutely nothing left to say to him. The federal government would handle his punishment from here on out. "See you in court, brother," I said. I turned my back on him and walked toward the exit. The brass bell chimed brightly as I pushed the glass door open and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The rain had finally stopped and the dark, heavy clouds were beginning to break apart. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, fresh air. The toxic weight of Julian Caldwell was completely gone. The bailout had failed. The trap was permanently sealed, and I was finally free to go claim my true legacy. The rain was falling in heavy sheets against the single-pane glass of my new apartment window. It was a modest 1-bedroom unit on the 2nd floor of an older brick building located on the quiet side of town. The wooden floorboards creaked under my weight and the old radiator in the corner hissed with a constant metallic hum. It was a massive visual downgrade from the sprawling luxury estate I had financed for the past decade. But as I sat at the small second-hand kitchen table drinking a glass of tap water, I felt a profound sense of peace. The space was entirely mine. There were no lies hidden in the walls. There were no expensive designer furnishings purchased with stolen money. I was finally rebuilding my foundation on solid ground. Spread out across the table in front of me were my children's language workbooks. Quinn and Leo were still safely tucked away at their European immersion camp, completely unaware of the absolute destruction their mother had caused. I was looking over the new lesson plans I had ordered for them. They already possessed the brilliant ability to read, write, and speak English, Italian, and German. But I was preparing their next advanced curriculum. I wanted them to start learning Mandarin the moment they returned home. I have always known that Mandarin is the language of the future. My father used to give me a father's advice about preparing for a changing world. He told me that true vision requires understanding how the rest of the globe communicates. I wanted my kids to have that massive strategic advantage. I wanted them to be equipped to navigate any culture and any challenge life threw at them. My quiet evening planning my children's future was suddenly interrupted by 3 sharp, frantic knocks at my front door. I looked at the digital clock on the stove. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night. I walked slowly to the door and looked through the small brass peephole. My stomach muscles tightened instantly, but my heart rate remained perfectly slow and controlled. Standing in the dimly lit hallway, dripping wet from the cold rain, was the woman who had proudly handed me divorce papers at the Oakwood Country Club just 10 days ago. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Victoria was standing there, shivering violently. The transformation in her physical appearance was truly staggering. The cold, calculating predator who had strutted through the country club in a stunning black designer dress was entirely gone. She looked like a woman who had just survived a massive shipwreck. Her expensive blonde hair was tangled and plastered to the sides of her pale face. She was wearing a simple tan trench coat over a pair of cheap sweatpants. The designer handbags and the arrogant smirk had been completely erased by the crushing weight of federal law enforcement. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Her makeup was smeared down her cheeks, mixing with the rain and the fresh tears. She did not wait for an invitation. She practically threw herself into my small apartment, pushing past me to get out of the cold hallway. I closed the door quietly behind her, locking the deadbolt with a solid metallic click. "Harrison, you have to help me." Victoria sobbed, her voice cracking with raw panic. Her whole body was shaking as she stood in the center of my small living room, looking completely out of place among the cheap furniture. I did not offer her a towel. I did not ask her to sit down. I simply crossed my arms over my chest and stared at her with absolute clinical detachment. I asked her what she was doing at my apartment in the middle of the night. She covered her face with her trembling hands and let out a loud, dramatic wail. "It is Julian," she cried. "He is a complete monster, Harrison. The federal government seized absolutely everything today. They locked down his bank accounts. They put a lien on the mansion, and they seized my interior design business. They are saying we owe $35 million for some kind of toxic environmental cleanup." Julian lost his mind. "He blames me for everything. He kicked me out of the house into the rain and told me I was entirely on my own. I have absolutely nowhere else to go." I walked slowly toward the small kitchen counter and leaned against it. I watched her perform. It was a truly fascinating psychological display. Victoria had spent the last year sleeping with my own brother in luxury hotels funded by my hard-earned money. She had maliciously forged my signature to steal my family legacy. She had filed a fabricated restraining order to lock me away from my own children. And now that her glamorous new king had lost his crown, she was standing in my cheap apartment trying to play the ultimate victim. I kept my voice perfectly flat and entirely devoid of any sympathy. I told her that federal Superfund liability is a very serious matter. I pointed out that when you aggressively transfer a massive piece of unzoned industrial real estate into your primary holding company without doing any basic soil testing, you legally assume all the catastrophic risk. Victoria dropped her hands and stared at me. Her tear-filled eyes widened as she desperately tried to read my completely blank expression. She took a hesitant step forward, reaching her hand out toward me like a frightened child seeking comfort. "I did not know Harrison," she pleaded, her voice dropping into a soft, manipulative whisper. "You have to believe me. I did not know anything about toxic dirt or federal laws. Julian orchestrated the entire thing. He manipulated me from the very beginning. He preyed on my stress from the business. He whispered all these grand promises into my ear, and I was just so exhausted and confused that I fell for it. He forced me to do those terrible things to you." I felt a cold, sharp spike of disgust hit the back of my throat. She was actually trying to rewrite history right in front of my face. She was perfectly willing to throw the man she claimed to love directly under a federal bus just to save her own skin. I raised a single eyebrow and asked her exactly what Julian had forced her to do. Victoria swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously around the small room. She saw an opening. She thought she could completely absolve herself of all the criminal guilt by turning state evidence against my brother. She thought if she played the terrified, abused woman, I would naturally revert back to being the responsible, protecting husband she had taken for granted for 10 years. "He made me forge the documents, Harrison," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured guilt. "He told me that if I did not sign your name on that durable power of attorney, he would leave me and ruin my business. He is the one who hired the corrupt notary from his real estate firm to stamp the paperwork. He told me exactly which safety deposit box to go to. He made me walk into that regional bank branch and physically steal the Black Ridge Trust bearer deed. I did not want to do it. I swear on the lives of our children I was terrified the whole time. I remained perfectly still. I did not react to her bringing Quinn and Leo into her web of toxic lies. I needed her to keep talking. I needed her to paint the entire picture with her own words. I asked her about the money. I asked her about the $142,000 that disappeared from our joint savings account just hours before our anniversary dinner. Victoria nodded frantically, wiping the dark-smeared makeup from her cheeks. "That was his idea too," she cried out, stepping even closer to me. "Julian told me that we needed to hide the liquid cash before the divorce judge could freeze the marital assets. He drafted the fake vendor invoices for luxury interior design consulting. He forced me to wire the entire balance of our family savings directly into Apex Horizon Development. He said it was the only way to protect our future. He completely brainwashed me, Harrison." She took one final step forward, closing the physical distance between us. She reached out and placed her cold, damp hands directly onto my chest. She looked up at me with big, pleading eyes, trying to summon the ghost of the woman I used to love. "I can fix this, Harrison," she whispered, her voice dripping with desperate manipulation. "I know exactly how Julian operates. I have access to all his private emails and the fake invoices. I will go to the federal prosecutors tomorrow morning. I will testify against him in federal court. I will tell the judge that Julian orchestrated the massive fraud scheme and the forgery. I will completely clear your name in the civil lawsuit. I will give you everything you need to destroy him permanently." She paused, letting the massive weight of her offer hang in the quiet air of the apartment. It was the Viper's ultimate bargain. She was offering me the head of my betraying brother on a silver platter, but I knew exactly what the venomous catch was going to be. I looked down at her hands resting on my shirt and asked her what she wanted in return for this grand testimony. Victoria let out a shaky breath and leaned her weight against me. "I just want to come home, Harrison," she cried softly. "I want our family back. I want you to tell the federal agents that I was a victim of his aggressive manipulation, so I do not go to federal prison for wire fraud and forgery. We can drop the divorce. We can move past this horrible nightmare. You have always been the strong one. You have always been the man who protects this family. Please, just protect me one last time, and I promise I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you." I stood there listening to the steady hum of the radiator in the corner of the room. I let the absolute silence stretch out for 10 long, agonizing seconds. I wanted her to feel the weight of her own confession. I wanted her to believe that her manipulation was actually working. I wanted her to think that the boring insurance underwriter she had discarded like absolute garbage was actually foolish enough to let a venomous snake back into his house. I looked at her cold, pale face. I did not feel an ounce of anger. I did not feel an ounce of sorrow or lingering love. I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, clinical satisfaction of a man closing a flawless trap. I reached my right hand slowly into the inside pocket of my suit jacket, which was draped neatly over the back of a nearby dining chair. My fingers wrapped around the small rectangular piece of plastic and metal hidden deep inside the lining. I pulled the device out and held it up right between us, where the dim overhead light could catch the small glowing red indicator on the top screen. It was a high-definition digital audio recorder. Victoria stared at the small black device. The desperate, pleading expression on her face completely froze. Her breathing stopped entirely. The silence in the room was suddenly broken by a loud, sharp electronic beep as my thumb pressed down firmly on the stop button. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, forcing her hands to fall away from my chest. "I let you talk for a very specific reason, Victoria," I said, my voice dropping into a cold, unyielding tone. Under federal law, wire fraud and the forgery of financial instruments across state banking lines carry a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Conspiracy to launder marital assets through a shell corporation adds another 5 years. Victoria began to shake her head in absolute slow motion. The reality of what she had just done was crashing down on her like a collapsing building. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat was completely paralyzed by pure, unadulterated terror. "You came into my home, and you freely admitted to executing a massive financial forgery." I continued dissecting her confession with the precision of a prosecuting attorney. "You admitted to stealing a physical bearer deed from a federally insured safety deposit box. You admitted to wiring $142,000 of stolen family money into a corporate account using fabricated vendor invoices. You gave me the exact timeline, the exact methods, and the exact motive. And you did it all in incredibly vivid detail." "Harrison, please," she gasped, clutching her chest as if she was physically suffocating. "You cannot do this. I am the mother of your children." I felt a sudden flash of heat in my chest at the mention of Quinn and Leo, but I pushed it down instantly. "You stopped being their mother the moment you stole their future to fund a fantasy life with my brother," I replied, my voice echoing harshly in the small room. "You filed a fabricated restraining order claiming I was a violent danger to my own kids. You tried to leave me homeless and completely bankrupt so I could never afford to fight you for custody. You did not care about the kids when you were drinking expensive wine with Julian. You only care about them now because you need a human shield to hide behind." I walked over to the kitchen counter and placed the digital recorder safely next to my children's language workbooks. I picked up my cell phone and unlocked the screen. "Julian is already going to federal prison because his incredible arrogance blinded him to a $35 million toxic liability," I said, looking back at her shivering form. "But I needed a way to guarantee that you would never be able to manipulate a family court judge into giving you shared custody of my children. I needed absolute concrete proof that you are a clinical sociopath who commits financial felonies without a second thought. And you just walked right through my front door and handed that proof directly to me." Victoria fell to her knees on the creaking wooden floorboards. She clasped her hands together, begging and screaming my name. She promised to sign away all her parental rights. She promised to leave the state and never contact us again. She was drowning in the absolute wreckage of her own incredible greed, and she was desperately clawing at anything she could reach. I looked down at the woman I had spent 15 years building a life with. She had chosen the glamour and the flash of a sinking ship over the solid foundation of a loyal husband. She had made her viper's bargain a long time ago. I had absolutely no mercy left to give her. I pressed the speed dial button on my phone and held the speaker up to my ear. I listened to the line ring twice before the local police dispatcher answered the call. I looked Victoria directly in the eyes. "The kids already know the truth, Victoria," I said, my voice completely steady and absolutely final. "And now so does the judge." The heavy oak doors of the county courthouse swung shut behind me, sealing the room in a thick, suffocating silence. It had been exactly 1 month since my 10th wedding anniversary dinner. 1 month since my wife slid a manila envelope across a white linen tablecloth and my own brother tossed a $100 bill at my face. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, feeling the solid weight of the polished wooden floor beneath my leather shoes. I was wearing the exact same tailored suit I wore on that terrible night. But the man wearing it was completely different. I was no longer the quiet, submissive underwriter who sacrificed his entire existence to build a fantasy life for ungrateful people. I was the architect of their absolute destruction. I took my seat at the plaintiff table next to my civil defense attorney. The courtroom was an intimidating theater of high ceilings, dark mahogany walls, and cold fluorescent lighting. It was a place designed to strip away illusions and expose the absolute truth. I looked across the wide aisle and saw the two people who had conspired to erase my existence. They were sitting at entirely separate defense tables. The grand, glamorous power couple that had walked out of the Oakwood Country Club arm in arm was completely dead. In their place were two bitter, desperate enemies trapped in a sinking cage of their own brilliant design. Julian looked like a cornered animal. His expensive, custom Italian suits were gone, confiscated by the federal government, along with his $3 million estate and his flashy sports car. He was wearing an ill-fitting gray suit that looked like he had purchased it from a discount rack just hours before the hearing. His perfect hair was unwashed and unkempt. His skin was a sickly pale yellow, and he was sweating profusely under the harsh courtroom lights. He was sitting next to an exhausted-looking public defender because every single bank account associated with his name was completely frozen by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. He had absolutely no money to hire the aggressive corporate lawyers he usually relied on to bully his way out of trouble. Victoria was sitting 10 feet away from him at a separate table. The physical toll of the past few weeks had completely shattered her carefully crafted luxury image. She was wearing a plain, dark blouse, and her designer jewelry was entirely missing. She refused to even look in Julian's direction. Her eyes were sunken and rimmed with dark, heavy circles of pure exhaustion. She was gripping a cheap plastic pen so tightly that her knuckles were entirely white. She had spent a decade manipulating my absolute loyalty, and she had thrown it all away for a man who was now facing decades in a federal penitentiary. They were both drowning in a $35 million toxic liability, and the only thing left for them to do was turn on each other like starving wolves. The heavy wooden door behind the bench opened, and the judge presiding over the Family and Civil Division walked into the courtroom. She was a stern, uncompromising woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. She took her seat, arranged her files, and looked down at the absolute legal disaster sitting in front of her. This was a combined civil hearing to address the fraudulent divorce petition, the fabricated temporary restraining order, and the massive theft of my marital assets. The judge called the courtroom to order, and the legal bloodbath officially began. Julian Public Defender stood up first, immediately attempting to distance his client from the forged corporate transfer. He stammered through a desperate, pathetic opening statement claiming that Julian was completely unaware of the stolen bearer deed. He argued that Victoria had acted entirely alone and maliciously manipulated the corporate structure to hide her own stolen marital assets. Julian sat there, nodding aggressively, trying to throw the woman he claimed to love directly into the fire to save his own skin. He wanted the court to believe he was just a naive real estate developer who accidentally absorbed a massive toxic wasteland. Victoria Public Defender immediately jumped up, slamming his hands on the table. He shouted that Julian was a master manipulator who had coerced a terrified woman into committing massive financial felonies. He claimed Victoria was a helpless victim who had been completely brainwashed by a wealthy, powerful man. Victoria began to cry right on cue, performing the exact same pathetic routine she had tried to pull in my living room. They were aggressively tearing each other apart in open court, proving to the judge exactly what kind of ruthless, self-serving predators they truly were. I sat there in perfect silence, watching them destroy whatever tiny shreds of dignity they had left. I did not interrupt. I did not show any anger. I just waited for the perfect moment to drop the absolute hammer. The judge banged her wooden gavel loudly, cutting off the pathetic squabbling between the two public defenders. She looked down at my attorney and asked if the plaintiff had any opening remarks or physical evidence to present to the court. My lawyer stood up slowly, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked confidently toward the center podium. He was holding a thick manila envelope that looked exactly like the one Victoria had used to serve me the divorce papers. It was a beautiful, deliberate, full-circle moment of poetic justice. My attorney addressed the judge with a calm, authoritative voice. He stated that we did not need to rely on desperate accusations or tearful courtroom performances. We simply had the absolute, undisputed truth. He opened the envelope and presented the primary exhibit. It was the original durable power of attorney that Victoria had used to access my secure safety deposit box. He placed the heavy document on the overhead projector, illuminating the forged signature across the massive courtroom screens. He then presented a certified forensic handwriting analysis, confirming that the signature was a flawless, calculated forgery executed by Victoria. He did not stop there. He produced the digital access logs from the regional bank branch, proving that Victoria had physically entered the vault exactly 3 hours before serving me the divorce petition. He then produced the expedited county transfer records, proving that Julian had personally signed the receiving documents to absorb the stolen property into his primary holding company. Julian's face turned a brilliant shade of crimson. He tried to stand up and shout an objection, but his public defender quickly yanked him back down into his wooden chair by his suit jacket. Victoria was shaking her head back and forth violently, staring at the projected documents like they were poisonous snakes. She knew the walls were rapidly closing in, but she still clung to her fabricated victim narrative. She whispered aggressively to her lawyer, telling him to argue that Julian had forced her to sign the papers under severe emotional duress. My attorney turned and looked directly at Victoria. He offered her a cold, clinical smile. He then walked back to our table, reached into his leather briefcase, and pulled out the small, high-definition digital audio recorder I had secured during her late-night visit to my apartment. He informed the judge that we had one final piece of highly relevant evidence to submit for the official court record. He explained that it was a voluntary, spontaneous confession recorded legally within the boundaries of my own private residence. The judge granted permission to play the audio file. The entire courtroom fell completely dead silent. The heavy air conditioning system hummed quietly in the background. My attorney pressed the play button and set the small device on the wooden podium. Victoria's own voice suddenly echoed through the massive courtroom speakers. It was crisp, clear, and absolutely devastating. Everyone in the room heard her crying in my small apartment. Everyone heard her vividly admit to forging my signature on the durable power of attorney. They heard her confess to secretly hiring a corrupt notary from Julian real estate firm to stamp the documents. They heard her explain exactly how they conspired to steal the cash from our joint savings account to hide it from the divorce proceedings. Most importantly, they heard her attempt to orchestrate a malicious federal perjury scheme, offering to lie on the witness stand against Julian if I agreed to protect her from prison. The Viper bargain was exposed for the entire world to hear. The audio recording completely obliterated every single lie they had built. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that they were both willing, active, and highly calculated participants in a massive criminal conspiracy designed to leave me homeless, bankrupt, and separated from my children. When the recording finally clicked off, the silence in the courtroom was physically suffocating. Victoria had completely collapsed in her chair. She buried her face in her trembling hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Her public defender slowly closed his legal notepad, recognizing that the case was entirely and completely unwinnable. Julian was staring at Victoria with a look of pure, absolute, unadulterated hatred. He realized that her desperate late-night attempt to manipulate me had just handed the federal prosecutors a wrapped gift box of undeniable criminal evidence. The judge removed her reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She looked down at the two defense tables with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. She had presided over hundreds of bitter divorces and complex financial disputes, but the sheer scale of their malicious greed was truly breathtaking. She did not need to deliberate. The evidence was overwhelming and entirely absolute. The judge picked up her heavy wooden gavel and delivered a ruling that severed their futures completely. She spoke with a sharp, unforgiving authority that echoed off the high mahogany walls. She immediately dismissed the fabricated temporary restraining order against me, citing it as a malicious weaponization of the family court system. She stated that using false allegations of emotional volatility to separate a dedicated father from his children was a truly despicable act. She officially granted me full, complete, and sole legal custody of my two children, with 0 visitation rights granted to Victoria, pending the final outcome of her federal criminal indictments. The judge then moved to the financial assets. She permanently revoked any possibility of alimony or spousal support for Victoria. She ruled that the money stolen from our joint accounts was a deliberate fraudulent transfer. But because those funds were now legally locked inside the holding company structure and frozen by the federal government, the judge made a highly specific and lethal ruling. She declared that Julian and Victoria were solely and entirely responsible for the $35 million federal environmental fines. They had stolen the property, they had forged the transfer, and they would carry the absolute crushing weight of the toxic debt for the rest of their natural lives. The sound of the gavel slamming against the wooden block sounded like a heavy steel door locking permanently into place. The civil hearing was officially over. I had won absolutely everything back regarding my freedom and my family. They were leaving the courtroom with absolutely nothing but massive federal indictments waiting for them in the hallway outside. 2 armed bailiffs immediately moved forward to escort the defendants out of the courtroom. Victoria could barely stand up. Her legs were completely shaking, and she had to lean heavily on her public defender just to walk down the center aisle. She did not look at me as she passed. She kept her eyes glued to the polished floor, completely crushed by the absolute reality of her own terrible choices. She knew she was heading straight into a federal holding cell. Julian, however, was not broken in the same way. His massive, fragile ego simply could not process the total failure of his brilliant master plan. As the heavy bailiff grabbed his arm to guide him toward the exit, Julian violently yanked his shoulder away. He stopped right in the middle of the aisle, directly across from my plaintiff table. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, desperate rage. His chest was heaving, and he was breathing in ragged, heavy gasps. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. He wanted to deliver one final crushing blow to my pride. He wanted to prove that he was still the golden child, still the superior brother, even as his entire life burned to ash around him. "You have nothing," Julian screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking and echoing wildly across the large, empty courtroom. "You think you won today, but you are still completely broke. You lost your high-paying corporate job. The federal government has all the stolen cash. You are living in a cheap, tiny apartment. You are a pathetic, boring underwriter, and you will never be a king. You have absolutely zero money left to your name." The bailiff aggressively grabbed Julian by the collar of his cheap gray suit and began physically dragging him toward the heavy oak doors. Julian kept screaming, kicking his feet, and fighting the officers, entirely consumed by his own toxic venom. I did not stand up. I did not yell back. I did not feel an ounce of anger or insecurity. I simply sat at the polished wooden table watching him completely unravel. I thought about the secondary key carefully hidden in my pocket. I thought about the private bank in Zurich and the true inheritance my father had left safely waiting for my children in Europe, entirely protected from American civil litigation. Julian had absolutely no idea that his blind greed had just eliminated him from the true family legacy forever. I looked at my brother as he was shoved forcefully through the exit doors. I offered him a calm, relaxed, and perfectly genuine smile. Then, using both hands, I reached up and slowly adjusted the knot of my tailored silk tie. I boarded a commercial flight across the Atlantic Ocean just 3 hours after watching my brother get dragged, kicking and screaming out of the county courthouse. The heavy hum of the jet engines was the first truly peaceful sound I had heard in an entire month. I sat in my quiet window seat watching the dark ocean slip past beneath me, and I felt the massive, crushing weight of the past few weeks finally begin to lift from my shoulders. Julian and Victoria were currently sitting in federal holding cells, waiting to face the absolute reality of their $35 million toxic debt. They had tried to bury me alive under a mountain of fabricated lawsuits and stolen assets, but their incredible greed had been their ultimate undoing. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window and closed my eyes. I was not flying to Europe to take a luxury vacation or to celebrate my courtroom victory. I was flying to Switzerland to finish the quiet, methodical work my father had started years before his death. I was traveling to secure the true legacy of the Caldwell family. I thought about my children, Quinn and Leo, as the plane chased the sunrise toward the European continent. They were currently nestled safely in the Bavarian Alps, completely shielded from the malicious financial slaughter their mother had attempted to execute. I had sacrificed my entire life savings to send them to that elite immersion program because I wanted them to understand the world on a much deeper level than the people around them. They already possessed the brilliant ability to read, write, and speak English, Italian, and German with incredible fluency. But my vision for their future did not stop with those traditional European languages. I also spent countless hours at our kitchen table deliberately encouraging them to learn Mandarin. I knew Mandarin is the language of the future, and I wanted my children to possess a massive strategic advantage in a rapidly changing global landscape. I wanted them to build their lives based on genuine solid substance rather than the fragile, hollow illusions that Julian chased. My father had taught me that exact same lesson about foresight and preparation. Now I was holding the final piece of his brilliant puzzle in my suit pocket, ready to lock their future into place. The plane touched down at the international airport in Zurich, just as the crisp morning air settled over the city. I bypassed the crowded baggage claim entirely because I carried absolutely everything I needed in a single leather briefcase. I took a quiet electric train into the heart of the financial district, watching the pristine, snow-capped mountains rise majestically in the distance. Zurich is a city that understands the absolute value of discretion and silence. It is the complete opposite of the loud, flashy arrogance my brother worshipped back in the United States. Julian believed that wealth was something you aggressively flaunted in country clubs and expensive sports cars. He thought power was measured by how loudly you could brag about your latest real estate acquisition. The people in this city understood that true generational wealth does not need to scream for attention. True wealth operates quietly in the shadows, building impenetrable fortresses that no civil lawsuit or aggressive creditor can ever breach. I walked down a narrow, immaculate cobblestone street lined with historic stone buildings. There were no massive corporate logos or glowing digital signs pointing the way to my destination. I stopped in front of a heavy, dark oak door with a small polished brass plaque bearing a single discreet family name. This was an exclusive private banking institution that had been managing international assets for over a century. I straightened my tailored suit jacket, took a deep, calming breath, and pushed the heavy wooden door open. The interior of the bank smelled of expensive polished mahogany, old leather, and absolute financial security. There were no crowded teller lines or noisy waiting areas. The grand foyer was dead silent, monitored by highly trained security personnel wearing immaculate dark suits. A tall, distinguished concierge approached me immediately, his posture perfectly straight and his expression entirely neutral. He greeted me politely in English, clearly recognizing my American tailoring, and asked how the institution could assist me this morning. I looked him directly in the eye and responded in flawless, confident German. I explained that I had a scheduled private appointment to access a secured family vault, and I presented my heavy brass key along with my United States passport. The concierge raised his eyebrows slightly, a faint glimmer of genuine respect flashing in his eyes when he heard my perfect pronunciation. Speaking the native language completely shifted the dynamic of the room. I was not just another loud American tourist stumbling through their elegant city. I was a prepared, meticulous client who understood their culture and respected their strict protocols. He bowed his head, slightly switched entirely to German, and escorted me down a long, dimly lit corridor toward the private administrative offices. I was seated in a beautiful private room featuring a massive stone fireplace and a large antique desk. A few moments later, a senior bank director named Herr Hoffman walked into the room carrying a thick leather-bound ledger. We shook hands firmly and continued speaking exclusively in German. It felt incredibly satisfying to use the exact same language skills I had so carefully nurtured in my children to navigate this massive final step of my journey. Herr Hoffman meticulously verified my identity, matching my passport and my biometric signature against the incredibly strict security records established by my late father. He examined the heavy brass key I placed on the desk, confirming the unique serial number engraved near the base. He offered his deep condolences for my father passing, noting that the senior Mr. Caldwell had been a highly respected client who valued absolute discretion and quiet stability. I thanked him for his kind words and requested immediate access to the secure vault. Herr Hoffman led me to a private elevator that descended deep beneath the historic city streets. We stepped out into a massive subterranean chamber constructed entirely of thick, reinforced concrete and polished steel. The air down here was incredibly cold and perfectly climate-controlled to preserve the delicate physical documents stored within the thousands of metal boxes. The absolute silence of the vault was beautifully terrifying. It was a place where massive global fortunes rested quietly, completely hidden from the chaotic outside world. We walked slowly down a long, illuminated aisle until we reached a specific heavy steel door. Herr Hoffman inserted his master electronic key into the primary lock and stepped back, granting me the privacy to insert my own brass key into the secondary mechanical lock. I turned the heavy metal mechanism and felt a solid, satisfying click echo through the freezing chamber. I pulled the small rectangular door open and reached my hand inside the dark space. I did not find a toxic bearer deed or a complicated real estate trap. I found a pristine leather portfolio and a sealed envelope bearing my father's elegant handwriting. The ink was slightly faded, but the message written across the front was incredibly clear. It simply said, "For Harrison, when the storm finally clears." I carried the portfolio and the envelope back up to the private reading room. Herr Hoffman offered me a cup of strong black coffee and discreetly closed the heavy mahogany door, leaving me entirely alone to process my true inheritance. I sat down in the leather chair, placed the warm coffee cup on the desk, and carefully opened the sealed envelope. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the thick parchment paper and began reading the final words my father had ever written to me. My father wrote that he had watched Julian grow into a man completely consumed by dangerous, reckless greed. He explained that he knew my brother would eventually try to steal the family legacy the exact moment he sensed an opportunity. My father understood that Julian worshipped aggressive leverage and flashy appearances above all else. That is exactly why he left the Black Ridge Trust deed in that vulnerable regional bank in America. The Black Ridge property was never a legitimate financial asset. It was a carefully engineered decoy. It was a massive toxic trap designed specifically to catch a thief who was too arrogant to read the fine print. My father wrote that he knew Julian would bypass standard environmental inspections just to hide the stolen land from the courts. He knew the $35 million Superfund liability would completely obliterate Julian's fragile empire. He had intentionally armed that trap and handed me the only map, knowing I would eventually need to use it to protect my children from their own uncle. I felt a hot tear slide down my cheek as I read the incredible depths of my father's protective wisdom. He had sacrificed his own peace of mind to construct a flawless defense mechanism for my family. But the letter did not end there. My father instructed me to open the heavy leather portfolio resting on the desk. He wrote that while Julian was busy fighting for poisoned dirt and federal indictments, he wanted me to have the clean, solid foundation I truly deserved. He said he had watched me empty my retirement accounts to support my ungrateful wife. He had watched me work double shifts to afford my kids' language programs. He knew I was the only person in the family who understood that true wealth is built on quiet sacrifice and absolute loyalty. I set the letter down and opened the leather portfolio. Inside was a massive stack of pristine certified banking documents entirely written in German and English. It was a fully established, irrevocable generational trust. It was not tied to unstable commercial real estate or aggressive, high-interest domestic loans. The trust was anchored entirely by sovereign international bonds and highly secure global equities. The bottom line of the primary account summary displayed a completely clean, fully liquidated balance of exactly $12 million. And because the trust had been legally established in Switzerland years before my disastrous marriage to Victoria, it was completely and permanently untouchable by any American civil litigation or family court interference. Victoria and her aggressive divorce lawyers could never claim a single penny of this money. Julian and his bankrupt holding companies could never cross-collateralize this fortune to save themselves from the federal government. I sat alone in the quiet Swiss reading room, completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the absolute victory. Julian had stood in that American courtroom screaming that I was a pathetic, broke underwriter who had absolutely nothing left to my name. He believed he had won simply because he had taken the visible pieces of my life. But while he was being dragged away to a federal prison to face a lifetime of toxic debt, I was sitting halfway across the world claiming a $12 million clean slate. My father had reached beyond the grave to deliver the ultimate poetic justice. He let the greedy wolves completely destroy themselves while quietly handing the keys to the kingdom directly to the son who played by the rules. Herr Hoffmann knocked softly on the heavy wooden door and re-entered the room. He carried a silver tray holding a very fine fountain pen and a small stack of final transfer documents. He explained that I simply needed to sign the administrative paperwork to officially assume full legal control of the massive international trust. He respectfully asked if I intended to keep the funds secured within their institution or if I planned to wire the assets back to the United States. I looked at the incredible wealth resting on the table and thought about my kids. I thought about Quinn and Leo learning Mandarin, Italian, and German. I thought about the beautiful global future I could now guarantee for them without any fear of financial ruin. I picked up the heavy fountain pen and tested the ink against the thick parchment paper. I told Herr Hoffmann in perfectly calm German that the money would remain exactly where my father had placed it. I explained that I was building a permanent fortress for my children, and I wanted their foundation to remain completely untouchable. I signed my name at the bottom of the final document, feeling the smooth glide of the ink securing our destiny forever. I set the pen down, stood up from the antique desk, and looked out the window at the distant snow-capped mountains. The bitter storm of betrayal was finally over. The trap had successfully consumed the guilty, and the true legacy was entirely mine to protect. 6 months is exactly 180 days. That is exactly how long it took for the federal government to completely dismantle the glamorous, sparkling illusion my brother had spent his entire life desperately trying to build. Julian is no longer a titan of commercial real estate. He does not wear custom-tailored Italian silk suits or drive a $3 million sports car to exclusive country clubs. The $35 million Superfund liability completely vaporized his holding companies and triggered immediate catastrophic defaults across his entire cross-collateralized financial portfolio. Today, Julian wears a stiff, heavy canvas apron. He works 40 hours a week at a local hardware store on the gray industrial side of the city. He spends his days sweeping dirty sawdust off concrete floors and carrying heavy boxes of metal fasteners for minimum wage. Every single Friday, when his manager hands him a meager paper paycheck, the federal government immediately garnishes 75% of his wages to pay down the massive toxic debt he aggressively stole from me. He lives in a small rented room located directly above a noisy auto repair shop. The smell of burning rubber and cheap engine oil constantly bleeds through his floorboards. He is a ghost of a man, completely trapped in a financial prison he built with his own 2 hands. Victoria did not fare any better in the aftermath of her massive betrayal. When the federal environmental auditors realized her luxury interior design business was legally and deeply intertwined with Julian corporate accounts, they seized every single asset she owned. The $142,000 she maliciously stole from our joint savings account was permanently confiscated by the United States Marshals Service. She now lives in a cramped, dark studio apartment located right next to a noisy, elevated train track. The walls constantly rattle every time a commuter train rushes past her single dirty window. She spends her evenings sitting on a cheap mattress, desperately trying to sell her old faded designer handbags and used shoes on the internet just to afford basic groceries. The arrogant, cold woman who slid divorce papers across a white linen tablecloth at the Oakwood Country Club is entirely gone. She traded a loyal, responsible husband who sacrificed absolutely everything for her dreams for a flashy, arrogant man who dragged her directly into an inescapable federal nightmare. While they drown in the absolute wreckage of their incredible greed, I am breathing the cleanest and crispest air I have ever known. I did not move back to the crowded city. I used a very small fraction of my father's $12 million international trust to purchase a beautiful, modest farmhouse sitting on 60 acres of pristine green land in upstate New York. The house is built from solid, heavy oak and native river stone. It is not a flashy, modern mansion designed to impress shallow acquaintances. It is a genuine, quiet fortress built to last for generations. I am sitting on the wide wrap-around wooden porch right now, holding a warm cup of black coffee and watching the morning sun rise over the distant, tall pine tree line. Down in the massive grassy yard, my children, Quinn and Leo, are running freely, chasing a golden retriever puppy we adopted last month. I can hear their bright, innocent laughter echoing across the wide-open space. They are shouting to each other in absolutely flawless Italian, effortlessly switching vocabulary as they play. Later today, we will sit at the heavy wooden dining table and practice their German and Mandarin. They are happy, healthy, and entirely safe. They do not know anything about the forged signatures, the stolen bearer deed, or the massive, terrifying federal raid. They only know that their father loves them more than anything in this world, and that he will never stop fighting to protect their incredible global future. The toxic chaos Victoria and Julian tried to violently inject into our lives has been completely and permanently erased. I look at my children playing in the morning light, and I know exactly what true wealth actually means. It is not measured by aggressive leverage or expensive luxury cars. It is measured by the absolute profound peace you feel when you know your family is standing on an unbreakable foundation. Sometimes I cast my mind back to that terrible 10th wedding anniversary dinner. I remember the cold, calculating smirk on my brother's face when he tossed a $100 bill onto the table and told me to call a cab to a cheap motel. I remember the absolute pure contempt in my wife's eyes when she handed me a fabricated restraining order and told me I was a boring, pathetic failure. They thought they took my future. But greed is a funny thing. It makes people blind to the poison they are swallowing. They were so incredibly desperate to steal my family legacy and leave me with absolutely nothing that they threw away every basic rule of caution and completely bypassed the truth. My father always knew that true character is revealed in the dark. He knew that the people who only chase the glamorous superficial surface will eventually dig their own graves. I did not have to seek out violent revenge. I did not have to shout or break things or stoop to their level of malicious cruelty. I simply stepped back and allowed their own blinding greed to consume them whole. If you have ever had everything stripped away by people you trusted, remember the best revenge is not destruction. It is letting them destroy themselves while you rebuild in silence. You stand your ground, you protect your integrity, and you let the undeniable truth do the heavy lifting. The solid foundation you build in the quiet aftermath will always outlast the fragile, glamorous castles they build on lies. Like and subscribe if you know the value of standing your ground. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that true power does not roar. It simply waits for the perfect moment to win the game.